Hey guys, welcome to Fanfic Fanatics. So in today's video we are gonna see what if Deku became a king. This story is The King in Yellow by the respected author Kira_abs. Make sure to show some love to their work. Before starting, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you are interested in MHA fanfictions. Now without wasting any more time, let's dive in. A small child, no older than 4, sat motionless on the cold asphalt, his eyes vacant and unfocused. The chill of the pavement seemed to seep into his bones, but he didn't shiver or move. A slow trickle of blood made its way down his face from a large gash on the right side of his forehead, mingling with the dirt and tears. His cheeks were smeared with a mixture of red and grime, but he didn't appear to notice the pain. Behind him, a small car was engulfed in flames, a stark, horrific reminder of the recent chaos. It was his mother's car, now reduced to a blazing wreck. Moments ago, a battle between a hero and a villain had erupted on this very street, their clash causing the car crash that had claimed his mother's life on impact. The air was thick with the pungent smell of burning metal and rubber. Despite the catastrophic scene, the child remained eerily still. He hadn't yet processed the gravity of the situation. The world around him seemed distant and surreal, the roaring flames and distant shouts merely a backdrop to his numbed silence. He simply sat there, staring blankly ahead, the reality of his loss not yet sinking in. 1 hour earlier, Izuku sat on the edge of the crinkly paper that covered the examination table, his legs swinging nervously. The room smelled of antiseptic and a faint hint of something sweet that he couldn't quite place. The walls were painted a dull, pale green, and posters of cheerful cartoon superheroes encouraging healthy habits were plastered unevenly. He glanced at his mum, who sat on a plastic chair next to the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She smiled at him, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She kept smoothing out the wrinkles in her skirt, a nervous habit that Izuku knew well. The door opened with a soft click and the doctor walked in, his white coat swishing around his knees. Izuku felt a rush of excitement, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The doctor smiled gently, but it didn't reach his eyes. He sat down on the rolling stool and cleared his throat. Izuku leaned forward, eyes wide with anticipation. "Mrs. Midoriya, Izuku," the doctor began, his voice soft but firm. "Thank you for waiting." Izuku felt his breath catch in his throat. He could barely sit still, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced at his mum, who gave him an encouraging nod. The doctor continued, but his words seemed to slow down, each one hitting Izuku like a physical blow. "Based on our findings, it appears that Izuku does not possess a quirk." The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment, Izuku thought he might fall off the table. The cheerful superheroes on the walls blurred as tears filled his eyes. The posters seemed almost mocking now. He looked up at his mum, her face pale and eyes shimmering with unshed tears. How is that possible? Both my husband and I have quirks. Is there some kind of mistake?" With a heartfelt sigh, the doctor continued, "I understand this is difficult news. We've run multiple tests, including a genetic analysis and an examination of his X-rays. Izuku has an extra joint in his pinky toe, which is a characteristic typically found in quirkless individuals." Inko tightened her embrace around Izuku, feeling his small body tremble against her. She pulled back slightly to look at his tear-streaked face, her heart aching for her son. She remembered the nights he had woken up, screaming and crying, speaking of terrifying dreams that left him shaken for hours. "Doctor," Inko said, her voice trembling, "Izuku has been having these dreams. Well, they're more like nightmares, really. He talks about a place with monstrous creatures and a twisted landscape. Could this have something to do with a quirk?" The doctor, still seated on the rolling stool, looked thoughtful for a moment before shaking his head gently. "Nightmares are not uncommon in children, Mrs. Midoriya. Given the stress and anticipation of waiting for a quirk to manifest, it's not unusual for his imagination to create such vivid scenarios. It's a way for his mind to process his anxieties. But they're not just dreams." Izuku's voice was insistent, cutting through the doctor's calm explanation. His wide, green eyes were filled with a desperate need to be understood. "They're real. The creatures, the place. I can feel it, smell it. It's like I'm really there. I know it sounds crazy, but I promise, it's not just my imagination." The doctor sighed and adjusted his glasses, giving Izuku a sympathetic look. I understand it feels real, Izuku, but there's no evidence to suggest these experiences are anything other than dreams. There's a possibility that you're experiencing something akin to lucid dreaming or even sleep paralysis, both of which can feel incredibly real. Izuku's face fell, his shoulders slumping as he realized the doctor didn't believe him. Inko squeezed his hand, her heart breaking at the sight of his defeated expression. But what if, Inko pressed, her voice softer now, what if there's more to it? Could we explore this further, just to be sure? The doctor shook his head again, more firmly this time. We can certainly monitor his sleep patterns if it becomes a significant issue, but from what you've described, there's no indication that this is related to a quirk. It's important to focus on helping Izuku cope with these dreams as part of his overall well-being. Izuku's eyes filled with fresh tears, and he buried his face in his mom's shoulder. The sterile room, with its bright lights and impersonal feel, seemed to close in around them. The cheerful posters on the walls felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of the heroes Izuku wanted to emulate but now felt he could never become. Inko stroked his hair, whispering soothing words, though she felt the sting of hopelessness herself. We'll find a way, Izuku, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. We'll figure this out together. As they left the hospital room, the reality of the doctor's words weighing heavily on them, Izuku clung to the belief that his dreams were more than just figments of his imagination. In his heart, he knew there was something real about that other world, even if no one else believed him. The car sped away from the hospital. Izuku sat quietly in the back seat, his mind swirling with the doctor's words and his mom's comforting reassurances. The cityscape blurred past the window, but his thoughts were far away, lost in the twisted landscapes of his dreams. Suddenly, a loud crash jolted him from his daydream. He perched up slightly, pressing his face against the window, eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. Up ahead, a massive villain burst out of a building, sending debris flying in all directions. The road was quickly littered with chunks of concrete and twisted metal. Mum, look! Izuku pointed, his voice a mix of awe and dread. Inko glanced quickly, her eyes widening in terror. Hold on, Izuku. As they watched, All Might, the greatest hero and Izuku's idol, emerged in pursuit of the villain. His presence, usually a symbol of hope and strength, now only added to the chaos and destruction unfolding before them. Izuku's excitement at seeing All Might in action was quickly overshadowed by fear as the battle moved closer to their car. We need to get out of here, Inko muttered, her voice tight with panic. She tried to swerve the car away from the danger, but the road was already becoming a war zone. Without warning, a large piece of rubble, hurled by the villain or displaced by the sheer force of the battle, smashed into their car. The impact was instant and brutal. The car lurched violently, spinning out of control. Izuku's world became a whirlwind of chaos, metal crunching, glass shattering, the sickening feeling of the car rolling over and over. Izuku clung to his seat, his small body thrown about despite the seatbelt holding him in place. The only sound that filled his ears was the deafening roar of destruction, a terrifying symphony of crunching metal and breaking glass. He heard his mum scream, her voice a raw, desperate cry that cut through the noise. Finally, the car came to a jarring stop, upside down and crumpled like a discarded toy. For a moment, everything was eerily silent. Izuku's ears rang, his vision blurred. He could smell gasoline and smoke, mingling with the sharp tang of blood. Izuku looked around, his vision slowly clearing as the reality of their situation settled in. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears like a drum. He turned his head, searching for his mother, and his breath caught in his throat. Inko lay motionless beside him, her body pinned by the wreckage. The sight of her lifeless form sent a shock of cold fear through his veins. Mum! He cried out, his voice breaking. But there was no response, only the eerie stillness of the ruined car. Then he saw it. Beside his mother's body, something began to shift and take form. At first, it was just a shadow, a nebulous mass of dark energy and shimmering stardust. But as Izuku watched, paralyzed by fear, it grew more distinct. Tendrils of gravitational force coiled around its amorphous body like the arms of a cosmic octopus, moving with an unsettling, fluid grace. Its features were obscured by a haze of distortion, making it difficult to discern any concrete shape. Yet, two glowing, hypnotic eyes pierced through the murk, flickering with an otherworldly intelligence. They locked onto Izuku, and he felt a strange pull, as if those eyes could see right through him, into his very soul. A mouth appeared below the eyes, a maw that whispered ancient secrets. The sound was a low, haunting murmur, a language that Izuku couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. The whispers were both terrifying and strangely familiar, resonating with the nightmares that had plagued his sleep. Izuku wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen in place, his body refusing to obey his desperate commands. The creature seemed to shift closer, its presence oppressive and otherworldly. He could feel its power, an overwhelming sense of ancient, cosmic knowledge that pressed down on him like the weight of the universe. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature began to dissolve, its form unraveling back into the nebulous mass of stardust and dark energy. The hypnotic eyes dimmed, and the whispers faded, leaving Izuku in the silent wreckage once more. Izuku stumbled out of the wreckage, his body moving on autopilot as if guided by some unseen force. His eyes widened as he took in his surroundings, a surreal landscape of twisted buildings and flickering shadows. Grotesque creatures lurched in and out of reality, their forms shifting and glitching before his very eyes. The ground beneath him felt wrong, as if it was made of shifting sand or unstable foundations. With each step, he sank slightly, the earth swallowing his feet before spitting them back out again. The air around him seemed to hum with an electric energy, and he caught strange, unfamiliar scents that made his stomach churn. Just as quickly as they had appeared, the twisted buildings and grotesque creatures vanished, leaving behind an empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. Izuku blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed, but before he could grasp the truth of it all, a police officer came running up to him, shouting something unintelligible. Then, everything went black. As Izuku woke up, he immediately sensed that something was different. The hospital room seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy, and as he looked around, he realized that his surroundings had been transformed. His vision, once clear and ordinary, now danced with a kaleidoscope of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The world around him had shifted, blending the mundane reality that most people perceived with the mysterious realm of the veil. It was as if a thin, translucent curtain had been pulled back, revealing a distorted and nightmarish version of the world. It reminded him of a place where the laws of physics and reality no longer applied. In this eerie realm overlaid the everyday world, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. The walls seemed to ripple, shadows danced with a life of their own, and strange, otherworldly noises whispered from the corners of the room. Alongside the mundane structures and familiar landmarks, monstrous entities lurked in the shadows, their grotesque forms twisting and writhing with an otherworldly malevolence. They were eldritch horrors, straight out of H.P. Lovecraft's darkest nightmares, their very presence sending a chill down Izuku's spine. He closed his eyes, praying that it was a cruel joke from the gods. Trying to seek solace in the silence, but this realm had a different plan. The trees here seemed to whisper to him, their voices carried by the ever-blowing icy wind. Shrill disembodied screams vibrating from outside the hospital window. Creeping up to the glass, they crawled into his rib cage and sunk into his heart like spiders that hollow you out. The sound of the sliding door snapped him out of his thoughts. Izuku's eyes snapped open. He was met with the sight of a nurse standing at his bedside, her expression a mix of surprise and relief. But his relief quickly turned to horror as he saw the monstrous entity that followed closely behind her. The creature's form was a shimmering mass of pulsating energy and writhing tendrils, with strands of bioluminescent light coiling around its amorphous body like serpents of cosmic vitality. Its features were obscured by a veil of shimmering energy, leaving only glowing eyes that flickered with an otherworldly intelligence and a mouth that whispered ancient incoherent incantations of healing that sent shivers down his spine. Izuku's scream echoed through the room as he recoiled in fear, his heart pounding in his chest. The nurse turned to him, her eyes widening in alarm, but when she followed his gaze, she saw nothing but empty space behind her. "What's wrong, dear?" the nurse asked, her voice tinged with concern. But Izuku couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature, its gaze locking onto his with a strange intensity. To his horror, the creature seemed to smile when it realized that Izuku could see it. "Do you see it?" Izuku whispered, his small voice trembling with fear. The nurse's expression softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and pity. "See what?" she asked gently. The monster, Izuku stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. It's right there, behind you. The nurse's brow furrowed, her concern deepening. I'm sorry, honey, she said softly, reaching out to comfort him. But there's nothing there. You've just woken up from a long coma, and it's not uncommon to experience hallucinations or confusion. Izuku's heart sank as her words sank in. He looked back at the creature, still hovering in the air, its eyes fixed on him with an unsettling magnitude. He knew it was real, could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his soul. But to the nurse, it was nothing more than a figment of his imagination, a product of his fractured mind. Desperate to make her understand, Izuku pleaded with her, his voice filled with urgency. Please, you have to believe me. It's really there, I swear. But the nurse only shook her head sadly, her expression sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry, sweetie, she said gently. But I can't see what you see. It's going to be okay, though. As she turned away to attend to her duties, Izuku was left alone with the creature, its presence looming over him like a shadow. The air felt colder, the room darker, and the creature's whispers grew louder, more insistent. He knew that he was the only one who could see the truth, the only one who could confront the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The nurse helped Izuku out of the bed, her movements gentle and patient. Take your time, sweetie, she said, her voice filled with encouragement. A little walk might help you feel better. Izuku nodded, still feeling disoriented, and allowed her to guide him. His legs felt weak and shaky as he took his first few steps, but the nurse kept a steadying hand on his arm. The hospital hallway was quiet, the soft hum of machines and the occasional distant voice the only sounds breaking the silence. As they walked, Izuku felt a strange mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Everything felt different, like he was seeing the world through a new, unsettling lens. The nurse let him explore at his own pace, her eyes always watchful and kind. Eventually, they reached a small bathroom, and Izuku hesitated before stepping inside. He felt an inexplicable pull to see himself, to understand what had changed. Taking a deep breath, he walked in and turned to face the mirror. The sight that greeted him made him freeze. His reflection was both familiar and alien. His once vibrant green eyes, always so full of life and curiosity, had dulled to a cold, lifeless gray. It was as if the spark that had defined him was now extinguished, replaced by a haunting emptiness. His hair, usually a wild tangle of dark green, now bore a stark streak of white, peeking out from under the bandages that wrapped around his head. The white hair contrasted sharply with the rest, a glaring reminder of the trauma he had endured. It made him look older, like a small part of his childhood had been stripped away. Izuku raised a trembling hand to touch the bandages, his fingers grazing the edge where the white hair emerged. His reflection stared back at him, unblinking and somber. He felt a pang of sadness and confusion. How had everything changed so much in such a short time? As he stood there, lost in thought, the nurse appeared behind him in the mirror, her expression gentle and concerned. It's okay, dear, she said softly. You've been through a lot, but you're strong. You're still you. He turned to look at her, tears welling up in his eyes. Why do I look so different? He asked, his voice small and vulnerable. She knelt down to his level, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Sometimes, when we go through very difficult experiences, it can change us, both inside and out, she explained. But those changes are part of your story, and they show how brave you've been. Izuku nodded slowly, trying to absorb her words. He glanced back at his reflection, the face that looked back at him still alien to him, but it was something he could learn to live with. For 9 long years, Izuku drifted from one foster home to another. Each family initially welcomed him with open arms, but it never lasted. The pattern was always the same. He would mention the creatures he saw, the monstrous entities lurking just beyond the veil, and the families would quickly change their tune. They didn't need the trouble, they said. They didn't want to deal with a mentally ill child, they explained. By the 6th foster home, Izuku had learned to keep his visions to himself. Talking about the veil only brought more pain and rejection. The latest family that had taken him in was far from ideal. They were nice enough to fulfill the basic requirements of a foster family, but Izuku knew their kindness was superficial. Their true motive was the money they received for taking him in. They weren't cruel, but their indifference cut just as deep. Izuku quickly learned the rules of survival in this new environment. Keep his head down, stay out of trouble, and never, ever mention the veil. The family had made it clear. If he caused any problems, they would toss him out on the streets. The threat was always there, hanging over his head like a dark cloud. Despite the coldness of his new home, Izuku found solace in his own inner world. He immersed himself in his studies, finding refuge in books and schoolwork. Knowledge became his escape, a way to drown out the whispers of the creatures. He kept his interactions with his foster family to a minimum, doing his best to be invisible. School was both a haven and a minefield. On one hand, it was a place where he could lose himself in learning, where he could pretend, even if just for a few hours, that he was a normal kid. On the other hand, the veil never truly left him. The eldritch horrors were always there, lurking at the edges of his vision. Izuku's classmates saw him as a quiet, studious boy, perhaps a bit odd but harmless. He had no close friends, but that was fine with him. Friendships required honesty, and honesty had only ever brought him pain. One day, after a particularly rough afternoon where he had narrowly avoided a confrontation with one of the veil creatures, Izuku sat alone on the steps of his school. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. He pulled out a worn notebook, one of his few possessions that held any personal significance. In it, he had meticulously documented everything he knew about the Vale and its inhabitants. He sighed deeply, lost in the pages of his notebook, when a sudden force yanked it from his hands. He looked up in alarm to see Bakugo standing over him, a smug grin plastered on his face. "Whatcha got here, Deku?" Bakugo sneered, flipping through the notebook's pages. "Still writing down all your useless dreams?" Izuku scrambled to his feet, reaching out in desperation. "Give it back, Kachan." But then he froze, his eyes widening in terror as he saw the monstrous entity that always followed Bakugo. The creature was a formidable sight, resembling a colossal, twisted amalgamation of a crustacean and a cephalopod. Its form was constantly shrouded in a thick, pungent smoke that obscured its true shape. The creature's main body was armored with overlapping plates of dark, almost obsidian-like exoskeleton that glowed with a fiery, molten light from within the cracks and joints. These plates were jagged and sharp, capable of slicing through the toughest materials. Beneath this armor, its flesh was a seething mass of pulsing, red-hot magma, barely contained by its shell. Its head was a grotesque fusion of dragon and insect, with a maw filled with serrated, molten teeth that dripped with a substance resembling liquid fire. Its eyes were multiple, scattered across its head in irregular patterns, each one glowing with an intense, fiery light that reflected its unending rage and hunger for destruction. From its back sprouted multiple massive tentacles, each ending in a cluster of explosive orbs that resembled Bakugo's grenades. These tentacles could whip and lash out with incredible force, causing massive explosions on contact. Bakugo's laughter cut through Izuku's fear, bringing him back to the present. "What's the matter, Deku? You look like you've seen a ghost." Izuku couldn't tear his eyes away from the monster. It loomed behind Bakugo, its eyes locked onto him with a predatory intensity. He felt the heat radiating from its molten body, saw the smoldering tips of its tentacles, and knew that one wrong move could be disastrous. "Just give it back," Izuku pleaded, his voice trembling. He tried to keep his focus on Bakugo, to ignore the towering horror that seemed ready to strike at any moment. Bakugo's mocking laughter echoed in Izuku's ears, his taunts stinging worse than usual. "You're crazy, Deku. Seeing monsters that aren't even there." He sneered, stepping closer. "Pathetic." Izuku's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. The oppressive heat radiating from Bakugo's entity was unbearable, sweat forming on Izuku's brow as he tried to maintain his composure. The creature's presence was suffocating, its molten eyes glaring at him with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Stay away from me, Kachan," Izuku pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. But Bakugo only grinned, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "What's the matter, Deku? Scared of your own shadow?" In a final stroke of malicious genius, Bakugo gripped Izuku's shoulder with a crushing force, his fingers digging into Izuku's flesh. "Let me show you what real power looks like," he said, activating his quirk. The explosion was immediate. A searing pain erupted from Izuku's shoulder, far worse than it should have been. His vision blurred as he saw the surprised look on Bakugo's face, a momentary flash of confusion and shock. Bakugo's hand jerked away as if he'd touched something scalding, but the damage was already done. Izuku's shoulder was engulfed in agony, the heat far beyond anything Bakugo could have intended. The sour smell of burning flesh filled the air, and Izuku screamed, the sound tearing from his throat as he collapsed to the ground. The pain was excruciating, his shoulder a mass of third-degree burns, the skin charred and blistering. Bakugo took a step back, his face a mix of horror and disbelief. What the hell? He started, but the words died on his lips. Izuku writhed on the ground, the world around him fading to a dull roar. In his mind, one thought stood out, clear and undeniable: the entities within the veil could physically hurt him. The realization was as devastating as the pain itself, a chilling truth that left him feeling more isolated than ever. As the searing agony overtook him, Izuku's vision dimmed. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the monstrous entity looming over him, its eyes glowing with a malicious satisfaction. It had wanted this. It had fed off the chaos and pain. When Izuku woke up, he was back in the hospital, the sterile white walls a stark contrast to the nightmarish reality he had faced. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, the pain dulled by medication but still a constant, throbbing reminder of what had happened. A nurse stood by his bed, her expression a mix of concern and pity. "You're awake," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" Izuku tried to sit up, but the effort sent waves of pain through his body. He sank back against the pillows, his voice weak. "What happened to me?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes flickering to his bandaged shoulder. "You suffered severe burns. They said it was an accident during a disagreement with another student." Izuku closed his eyes, the memory of Bakugo's face, twisted in shock and horror, flashing in his mind. But more than that, the image of the creature, the thing from the veil, lingered. He had felt its power, its malevolence. And now, he knew just how real the danger was. Izuku's thoughts drifted. He realized he couldn't ignore the veil or the creatures within it any longer. They were real, and they could hurt him in ways he hadn't imagined. He would have to find a way to protect himself, to understand these entities better. His life depended on it. The Tachibana family arrived at the hospital to pick up Izuku. As he climbed into the car, he could see that Daisuke Tachibana was barely containing his fury. His face was red, and his jaw was clenched tightly, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Hana Tachibana, on the other hand, seemed lost in her own world, her gaze distant and unfocused. She appeared to be completely oblivious to the tense atmosphere, her mind perhaps preoccupied with thoughts far removed from the current situation. In the backseat, Yuki Tachibana was absorbed in her phone, barely glancing up as Izuku settled beside her. Her only concern was her appearance, and the situation with Izuku was clearly an inconvenience she would rather ignore. As soon as the car doors closed and they were on their way, Daisuke's restraint snapped. "What hell were you thinking?" he yelled, his voice reverberating through the confined space of the car. "Getting into a fight and ending up in the hospital. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" Izuku stared at his hands, his fingers picking at the bandages on his shoulder. He wanted to explain, to tell them about the creature, the veil, and how he had been hurt in ways they couldn't understand. But he knew it would be pointless. They wouldn't believe him. They never did. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over Daisuke's tirade. He kept his eyes down, hoping to avoid further anger. Daisuke huffed, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "This better not happen again," he said, his tone warning. "We're only keeping you here because we need the money." Yuki glanced over, her expression one of bored disdain. "Yeah, don't screw this up for us," she added, before returning to her phone. Izuku leaned back in his seat. He knew he was on thin ice with the Tachibanas, just as he had been with every other family before them. The veil and its creatures had isolated him in more ways than one. As the car sped through the city streets, Izuku stared out the window, the familiar sights of the urban landscape blending with the distorted visions from the veil. Twisted buildings flickered in and out of his sight, and grotesque creatures skittered along the edges of his perception. He felt a deep, gnawing loneliness, a sense that he was trapped between two worlds, truly belonging to neither. The ride home was long and silent, punctuated only by Daisuke's occasional muttering. When they finally pulled up to the Tachibana house, Izuku felt a sense of relief. The next day at school was hell for Izuku. The pain from his burn was a constant, throbbing reminder of the previous day's events, making it difficult to focus on anything else. Every movement sent waves of agony through his shoulder, and the bandages felt tight and uncomfortable. Despite the pain, there was one small relief. Bakugo was avoiding him like the plague. Normally, Bakugo's presence was a source of constant torment, but today he kept his distance, his face a mix of confusion and anger whenever their eyes met. It was a temporary reprieve, but one that Izuku was grateful for. However, the respite didn't last long. Midway through the morning, a message crackled over the classroom intercom, calling both Izuku and Bakugo to the principal's office. Izuku's stomach dropped as he packed up his things, dreading what was to come. As he walked down the hallway, his heart pounded in his chest. The burn on his shoulder flared with every step, a painful reminder of Bakugo's explosive temper. When he reached the principal's office, he found Bakugo already there, slouched in a chair with a scowl on his face. Next to him sat Mitsuki Bakugo, Katsuki's mother, her face flushed with anger. "Sit down, Izuku," the principal said, his voice stern but not unkind. Izuku swallowed hard and took the seat next to Mitsuki, his eyes flicking nervously to Bakugo. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Mitsuki didn't waste any time. She turned to her son, her voice rising in anger. "Katsuki, what were you thinking? Using your quirk on a classmate. You could have seriously hurt him." Bakugo's scowl deepened, but he didn't look up. "It was an accident," he muttered, his tone sullen. "I didn't mean to burn him like that." Mitsuki's eyes flashed with frustration. "Accident or not, you need to be more careful. You can't just go around exploding on people because you're angry." The principal cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "This is a serious matter. Izuku has suffered severe burns, and this kind of behavior cannot be tolerated." He turned to Izuku, his expression softening slightly. "Izuku, can you tell us what happened from your perspective?" Izuku took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Bakugo grabbed my shoulder and used his quirk," he said quietly. It hurt more than it should have. I don't think he meant to burn me that badly, but it happened." Bakugo shot him a glare, but Mitsuki's hand on his arm kept him silent. The principal nodded, his face grave. "Thank you, Izuku. We'll need to take disciplinary action to ensure this doesn't happen again. Katsuki, you will be given detention and mandatory counseling sessions to work on controlling your quirk and your anger." Bakugo's fists clenched, but he didn't argue. Mitsuki sighed, her anger giving way to a weary resignation. "Thank you, Principal," she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "We'll make sure he understands the consequences of his actions." As the meeting concluded, Izuku stood up, the pain in his shoulder a constant reminder of the ordeal. Mitsuki turned to him, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, Izuku. Katsuki will be held accountable. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to let me know." Izuku nodded and smiled weakly. As they both walked back to class, Izuku found himself subconsciously keeping his distance from Bakugo. Despite the tension between them, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered after their encounter in the principal's office. Lost in thought, Izuku's mind raced with questions. The pain from his burn throbbed with each step, a constant reminder of the danger he faced. But amidst the physical discomfort, a new idea took root in his mind. If the entities from the veil could touch him, could he touch them back? The notion was both terrifying and tantalizing. For years, Izuku had been a passive observer of the veil, unable to interact with the creatures that lurked just beyond his perception. But now, faced with the reality of their existence and their ability to harm him, Izuku couldn't help but wonder if he could fight back. After the incident with Bakugo's quirk, Izuku began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in the world around him. The boundaries between his reality and the veil seemed to blur more frequently. One night, while studying late, the eerie manifestations became impossible to ignore. His room was dimly lit by the soft glow of his desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. At first, The shadows appeared normal, but then Izuku noticed them beginning to move independently, elongating and shifting in ways that defied the laws of physics. He stared, his heart pounding in his chest as the shadows danced and twisted, forming shapes that were both familiar yet foreign. It was as if the shadows had a life of their own, moving with a fluidity and grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, a soft murmur that could have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves or the distant hum of traffic. But as Izuku strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, their voices a cacophony of cryptic murmurs. The voices spoke in a language he couldn't understand, their tones filled with urgency and a sense of foreboding. Izuku felt a chill run down his spine as the whispers seemed to wrap around him, pulling him deeper into their dark, enigmatic world. He glanced around his room, his eyes wide with fear. The familiar objects, a stack of books, a picture of his late mother, his notebook, seemed to take on an otherworldly quality in the shifting light. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that flickered and wavered like smoke. Swallowing hard, Izuku tried to focus on his studies, but the whispers grew more insistent, demanding his attention. He felt a strange compulsion to listen, to decipher the cryptic messages hidden within the murmurs. His fingers trembled as he picked up his pen, his mind racing with thoughts of what these changes could mean. Was this another manifestation of the veil? Or was it something else entirely, something darker and more sinister? Izuku's thoughts returned to the question that had haunted him since the incident with Bakugo. If the entities within the veil could touch him, could he touch them back? And if so, what did that mean for him? As the days turned into months, the whispers grew more tenacious, their voices echoing through Izuku's mind like a relentless drumbeat. Amidst the cacophony of murmurs, one phrase stood out with chilling clarity. When the veil bleeds gold, the king shall rise. The words echoed in his mind, their meaning elusive yet undeniably ominous. What did it mean for the veil to bleed gold? And who, or what, was the king? Izuku pored over his notebook, desperate to find answers to the riddle that had consumed him. He scoured every page, searching for clues hidden within his scribbled notes and hastily drawn diagrams. But try as he might, the mystery remained unsolved, the whispers offering no further insight into their cryptic message. As Izuku delved deeper into the cryptic whispers of the veil, his research led him to an ancient passage buried within a dusty tome he found in the far corner of the school library. The book, bound in cracked leather and filled with yellowed pages, seemed to almost hum with a mysterious energy as he opened it. The passage spoke of a figure known as the King in Yellow, a being of immense power who held dominion over the veil and its nightmarish creatures. Izuku's heart raced as he read the description, feeling a strange resonance with the whispered prophecy that had been haunting him. The King in Yellow, the passage began, is a sovereign of shadows, a ruler of realms unseen. Cloaked in tattered robes of gold, he moves through the veil as its master, commanding the creatures that dwell within its depths. His arrival heralds a time of great upheaval, a period where the boundaries between worlds blur and bleed into one another. Izuku's fingers trembled as he turned the page, his eyes scanning the faded text with growing urgency. The description of the King in Yellow was unsettling, evoking images of a figure shrouded in mystery and dread. The passage went on to describe how the king could influence both the veil and the physical world, bending reality to his will. When the veil bleeds gold, the king shall rise, Izuku whispered to himself, the words now making a chilling kind of sense. The golden hue of the king's robes matched the prophecy, hinting at a connection between the bleeding of the veil and the king's emergence. As he continued reading, Izuku found accounts of those who had encountered the King in Yellow. These tales spoke of madness and terror, of minds broken by the mere sight of him. The king was described as both a harbinger and a judge, his presence marking a time of reckoning. Izuku's mind raced with the implications. If the King in Yellow truly had dominion over the veil and its creatures, then understanding him might be the key to mastering the forces that had haunted Izuku for so long. But it also meant that the prophecy he had been hearing was not just a cryptic warning but a dire prediction of events to come. For just a fleeting moment, the thought crossed Izuku's mind, what if he was the King in Yellow? The idea seemed absurd, and he couldn't help but chuckle at the notion. How could a quirkless loser who saw monsters be this enigmatic, powerful figure? Shaking his head, Izuku dismissed the thought as soon as it popped into his mind. The king in yellow was a figure of legend, shrouded in mystery and cloaked in power. Izuku, on the other hand, was just a kid struggling to navigate a world that seemed increasingly hostile and incomprehensible. He had no quirk, no strength, and no control over the bizarre entities that haunted his every step. Yet, despite his self-deprecating thoughts, a tiny seed of doubt remained. The whispers of the veil had led him to this knowledge for a reason, and the coincidences were too many to ignore entirely. Still, Izuku couldn't afford to indulge in such grandiose fantasies. He needed to focus on the tangible, on what he could do to survive and protect himself. As the days turned into weeks, Izuku continued his research, diving deeper into the history and lore of the Veil and its denizens. The ancient texts offered fragments of insight, pieces of a puzzle that he was determined to solve. All the while, he kept the prophecy in the back of his mind, wary of what it might mean for his future. Izuku's nights were filled with dreams, nightmares, really, of the king in yellow, his golden robes billowing in a wind that seemed to come from another world. In these dreams, Izuku felt a strange connection to the figure, a bond that he couldn't quite understand. But every morning, he would wake up, shake off the lingering fear, and remind himself of the absurdity of the idea. He was no king. He was just Izuku Midoriya, a boy trying to find his place in a world that had shown him little mercy. Once Izuku had conducted as much research as he could, it was time to put his theories to the test. Today was the day he would find out if he could touch the nightmarish creatures that lurked within the veil. He had spent countless hours preparing, his mind filled with a mixture of excitement and dread. But to carry out his experiment, he needed help. Specifically, he needed someone who wouldn't immediately think he was crazy. Izuku had managed to convince Yuki Tachibana to assist him. Yuki was not exactly the ideal partner for such a venture. She was vain, self-absorbed, and generally indifferent to his existence. However, Izuku had leverage. A love letter Yuki had written to Bakugo. The promise of delivering this letter to Bakugo had been enough to secure her cooperation, albeit begrudgingly. They met in the small, cluttered storage room of the Tachibana home, away from prying eyes. Yuki stood with her arms crossed, a look of impatience and annoyance on her face. All right, Izuku, what do you want me to do? This better not be a waste of my time, she said, her tone sharp. Izuku took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. Thank you for helping me, Yuki. This will only take a few minutes. I need you to watch and make sure nothing goes wrong. If anything happens to me, call for help immediately. Yuki rolled her eyes but nodded. Fine, whatever. Let's get this over with. Izuku focused his attention on the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pool and shift unnaturally. He could feel the presence of a creature from the veil, its form hidden just beyond the edge of his vision. Slowly, he extended his hand toward the darkness, his fingers trembling with anticipation. As his hand moved closer, the shadows seemed to react, coiling and writhing like a nest of serpents. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest as he reached out, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. When the veil bleeds gold, the king shall rise. His fingertips brushed against something cold and solid. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt before, simultaneously ethereal and tangible. The creature's form began to materialize, its grotesque features coming into focus. It was a monstrous entity, with eyes that glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light and tendrils that writhed and pulsed with a life of their own. Yuki gasped, her eyes wide with shock. What is that? Izuku didn't answer, his focus entirely on the creature. He pushed his hand further, pressing against the entity's surface. To his amazement, his hand didn't pass through. Instead, he felt resistance, as if touching something solid. The creature reacted, its tendrils lashing out and wrapping around his arm, the contact sending a jolt of icy pain through his body. He bit back a cry, gritting his teeth as he maintained his hold. I can touch it, he whispered, a mix of awe and fear in his voice. I can actually touch it. The creature's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Izuku felt a connection, a bridge between their worlds. The whispers intensified, filling his mind with a torrent of images and emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the creature recoiled, pulling away and retreating into the shadows. Izuku stumbled back, gasping for breath, his arm throbbing with pain where the tendrils had gripped him. He turned around to realize that Yuki had fainted. With an exhausted sigh, he managed to get Yuki back to her room, although not without difficulty. It appeared that Yuki had forgotten her role in his findings and Izuku was fine with that. For the next few days, Izuku conducted experiment after experiment, vigorously documenting everything within the hefty stack of notebooks he had acquired. One day, after a particularly rough afternoon, Izuku walked home from school. Navigating a few shortcuts, he spotted something that sent a shiver down his spine. There, lurking in the shadows of an alleyway, was an entity unlike any he had encountered before. It was a marvel of organic and inorganic fusion, its form a mesmerizing blend of flesh and pulsating energy veins that glowed with an ethereal light. Its presence radiated power and majesty, as if it were a living conduit for the cosmic forces that permeated the universe. The creature's head was a grotesque visage of twisted flesh and crackling energy, crowned with a halo of blazing stars and crackling electricity. Its eyes burned with an intense, otherworldly glow, each one a mesmerizing window into the infinite depths of the cosmos. Tendrils of crackling energy writhed and thrashed from its gaping maw, filling the air with an unearthly fervor that seemed to hum with a symphony. Izuku's heart raced as he beheld the creature, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and fascination. He had encountered many entities from the Vale before, but none had possessed the sheer magnitude and presence of this one. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should he approach the creature, or flee from its presence? But as he watched, the entity darted around a corner. Without thinking, Izuku raced after it. As Izuku rounded the corner, he came face to face with a scene that filled him with horror. There, before him, Bakugo was ensnared by what appeared to be a sludge monster, a villain with a quirk that transformed them into a grotesque, ever-shifting mass of thick, viscous sludge. But Izuku saw beyond the surface, recognizing the telltale signs of the Vale's influence. It was no ordinary villain that held Bakugo captive. Instead, it was an entity from the Vale, a malevolent being whose form shifted and morphed with every passing moment. Tendrils of thick, pulsating sludge writhed and thrashed, reaching out to ensnare their prey with a terrifying efficiency. The entity's body was a swirling mass of darkness and decay, oozing with an otherworldly energy that seemed to defy comprehension. Its presence filled the air with a palpable sense of dread, casting a shadow over everything it touched. For a moment, Izuku was frozen in place, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was witnessing. The entity had taken control of the sludge villain, using it as a vessel to carry out its nefarious deeds. His feet propelled him forward, before his mind could react. But in that crucial moment, something within him clicked, a realization that changed everything. With a surge of determination, Izuku reached out towards the entity, his hand trembling with uncertainty. But as his fingers made contact with the swirling mass of darkness, something extraordinary happened. A jolt of energy surged through him, sending sparks of electricity dancing along his skin. In that instant, he felt a connection, a merging of energies unlike anything he had ever experienced before. With a sense of awe and wonder, Izuku realized that he could temporarily merge with the creatures within the Vale. By willingly allowing their energies to intertwine with his own, he gained access to a limited, enhanced version of their powers. It was as if a door had been opened, revealing a world of possibilities that he had only ever dreamed of. With newfound confidence coursing through his veins, Izuku braced himself for the surge of energy that followed. In that moment of fusion, he felt the raw power of the entity flowing through him, imbuing him with strength and resilience beyond his wildest imaginings. His senses heightened, his perception sharpened, as he embraced the power that pulsed within him. However, as Izuku struggled to maintain his fusion with the sludge entity, a voice rang out from the crowd, sending a jolt of recognition through him. It was All Might, the symbol of peace and justice, the hero he had idolized when he was a child. But as memories of the car crash that claimed his mother's life flooded Izuku's mind, his heart skipped a beat. All Might was supposed to save everyone, to be the ultimate protector. So why hadn't he been there when Izuku needed him the most? The whirlwind of emotions threatened to overwhelm Izuku as he grappled with the conflicting feelings inside him. Everything was happening too fast, the world spinning out of control around him. But amidst the chaos, the fight didn't last much longer. All Might, with his unparalleled strength and determination, knew how to end a battle quickly. With a flurry of powerful blows, he incapacitated the sludge villain, bringing the confrontation to a swift and decisive end. As the dust settled and the adrenaline began to fade, Izuku stood against the wall, his hand pressed firmly against it for support. His head was spinning, and he struggled to keep himself upright. A few heroes gathered around Bakugo, tending to his needs. Meanwhile, All Might approached Izuku, his towering presence casting a shadow over the young boy. As All Might reached out to place a comforting hand on Izuku's shoulder, he instinctively recoiled, sidestepping the gesture with a mixture of fear and resentment. He couldn't bring himself to accept comfort from the hero who had failed to save his mother, who had shattered his belief in heroes. All Might's expression faltered, his arm hovering in mid-air for a few seconds before slowly lowering to his side. "Young man, are you all right?" All Might asked. His booming voice held a gentle ring to it that made Izuku's blood boil. For a moment, there was silence between them. Izuku struggled to find his voice, torn between the desire to lash out and the need to contain his emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with a quiet resolve. "I don't need your pity," he said, his gaze steady as he met All Might's eyes. As Izuku delved deeper into his merging with the entities and their energies, he discovered that there was more to the energy of the veil than he initially realized. The more he practiced and experimented, the more he began to understand the true extent of his abilities. One evening, while training in the secluded storage room of the Tachibana home, Izuku felt a surge of energy unlike any he had experienced before. It was as if the very fabric of the veil was opening up to him, revealing secrets that had been hidden from his sight. He focused his mind, drawing upon the energy that flowed through him, and began to shape it with his will. To his astonishment, the energy responded, coalescing into a tangible form. Before him, a shimmering construct began to take shape, a barrier of pure quark energy, translucent yet solid, pulsating with a soft, otherworldly glow. It was a protective shield, a manifestation of his newfound power. With growing excitement, Izuku pushed his abilities further. He envisioned a weapon, a blade of quark energy, and watched in awe as it materialized in his hand. The blade was ethereal, yet he could feel its weight and balance, as real as any physical weapon. But his exploration didn't stop there. Izuku discovered that he could create illusions as well, phantasms born of quark energy that could deceive the senses. With a wave of his hand, he conjured a swirling mist, within which flickered ghostly images of creatures from the veil. These illusions were more than mere trickery, they could confuse and distract, providing him with a versatile set of tools in various situations. As he honed his new abilities, Izuku began to understand the true potential of his connection to the veil. These temporary constructs, made of pure quark energy, offered him a way to protect himself and others, to fight back against threats, and to manipulate his surroundings in ways he had never imagined. He practiced tirelessly, refining his control over the constructs and exploring the limits of his power. Each day brought new discoveries, new possibilities, and with them, a growing sense of purpose. However, these newfound abilities did not come without their side effects. Izuku soon noticed that whenever his mind began to wander or he got lost in thought, he would find himself in places he had no intention of going. It was as if his legs had a mind of their own, leading him to locations brimming with the same energy he had come to associate with the entities from the veil. One morning, as he was walking to the store before school, his thoughts drifted to the events of the past few weeks, the discoveries, the dangers, and the cryptic whispers that still echoed in his mind. Without realizing it, his steps grew faster and more determined. When he finally snapped out of his reverie, he found himself standing outside UA High School, one of the most prestigious institutions for quirked individuals in the country. The imposing gates of UA loomed before him. Izuku felt a strange pull, as if the very energy that fueled his abilities was drawing him to this place. He could sense the concentration of quark energy around him, radiating from the students and faculty within the school grounds. Confused and a little unnerved, Izuku turned to leave, but his feet seemed reluctant to move. It was only with a great effort of will that he managed to tear himself away and head back to the store, his mind racing with questions. Why did his powers lead him to these places? This phenomenon began happening more frequently. Sometimes, He would find himself at bustling city squares filled with heroes and civilians, other times at quirk training centers or even hospitals specializing in quirk-related injuries. Each time, the energy of the veil seemed to be stronger, more concentrated. Despite the inconvenience and the occasional fear these episodes brought, Izuku couldn't help but feel that they were significant. It was as if the veil was trying to tell him something, guiding him toward a deeper understanding of his powers and his place in the world. Izuku began to keep a journal of these occurrences, noting the locations and any peculiar events or sensations he experienced. He hoped that by doing so, he might find a pattern or clue that would lead him to the answers he sought. In the meantime, he continued to refine his abilities, using the constructs and illusions to train and prepare himself for whatever lay ahead. Months passed, and the UA entrance exam came and went without Izuku even taking notice. In the back of his mind, he knew that Bakugo would have done great, but for Izuku, the thought of UA held no appeal. The thought of attending the same school as All Might, the hero he once idolized but now resented, was unbearable. After hearing that All Might was to be a teacher at UA, Izuku tried to avoid the school like the plague. Instead, Izuku chose a different path. He applied to a less renowned school with a focus on practical skills and individual growth rather than heroics. To support himself and keep busy, Izuku found a part-time job at a quaint little bookstore nestled in a quiet corner of the city. The store had an old-world charm, with creaky wooden floors, towering bookshelves, and the comforting scent of aged paper and ink. The owner, a kind but eccentric elderly lady named Mrs. Higurashi, seemed to have a particular interest in arcane subjects and alternative dimensions. Izuku quickly discovered that the bookstore's inventory included an extensive collection of books on supernatural phenomena, ancient myths, and theoretical physics. Some of these books even mentioned the veil in passing, a term he had thought unique to his own experiences. Intrigued, Izuku spent his free time poring over these texts, seeking any information that might help him understand his abilities and the entities that haunted his life. One evening, after closing the store, Izuku sat in a cozy reading nook with a particularly old and worn book titled, Dimensions Beyond, A Scholar's Guide to the Unseen Realms. The book was filled with cryptic references and obscure theories about parallel worlds and interdimensional beings. One passage caught his eye. The veil is a boundary, a membrane between worlds, where the energy of the cosmos converges. Those who can see and manipulate this energy are said to be chosen by the veil itself, marked for purposes unknown. Beware, for the veil's touch can be both a gift and a curse. The words resonated with Izuku, mirroring his own experiences and fears. As he read on, he found more references to the King in Yellow, a figure shrouded in mystery and power, believed to have dominion over the veil and its creatures. The book hinted at an ancient prophecy involving the king, but the details were frustratingly vague. Despite the ambiguity, Izuku felt a growing sense of connection to the knowledge he was uncovering. The bookstore had become more than just a job, it was a sanctuary and a treasure trove of insights into his unique abilities. Every day, he discovered something new, piecing together the puzzle of his existence one fragment at a time. Izuku's quiet life was a stark contrast to the chaos he had once envisioned for himself as a hero, but it was fulfilling in its own way. He continued to practice his abilities, creating constructs and illusions with increasing skill and precision. He also maintained his journal, recording his findings and experiences, hoping that someday, he would understand the full extent of his powers and the veil's purpose for choosing him. It was on a quiet day that things changed. Izuku was walking home from work, his mind drifting as the music from his headphones washed away his doubts. The rhythmic beats and melodies created a temporary haven, where he could momentarily forget about the veil and its constant whispers. But as he walked, his thoughts began to wander, and the familiar sensation of his surroundings slipping away overtook him. The next moment, Izuku found himself in the midst of chaos. The air was thick with the sounds of destruction, explosions, screams, and the roar of monstrous entities. He yanked his headphones off, his senses immediately assaulted by the cacophony. Panic and fear gripped the air as civilians scattered, fleeing from the scene of destruction. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the sight before him, a powerful villain, wreathed in darkness, wreaking havoc with a quirk that manipulated fear itself. The villain's presence sent shivers down Izuku's spine, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. A subtle shift in the air, a feeling of unease that lingered at the edges of his consciousness. Then, he noticed it. The presence of eldritch creatures, lurking in the shadows, their forms twisted and distorted by the destabilization of the veil. These creatures, normally invisible to all but Izuku, now flickered into view, their otherworldly shapes adding to the chaos and confusion. Izuku's breath caught in his throat as he realized the true extent of the danger. The villain's quirk had not only terrorized the civilians but had also disrupted the delicate balance of the veil, unleashing its horrors upon the city. Izuku attempted to intervene, his mind raced with strategies to mitigate the chaos unleashed by the villain's quirk. Drawing upon his knowledge of the veil, he sought to use his unique abilities to counteract the destabilization and protect the civilians caught in the crossfire. But to the observing heroes, Izuku's actions appeared mysterious and suspicious. As he summoned forth his constructs and manipulated the energies of the veil, it seemed as though he was controlling the very monsters causing the chaos. The shimmering barriers and weapons he conjured appeared to the heroes as manifestations of the eldritch creatures, adding to the confusion and distrust. As Izuku continued to intervene, his efforts caught the attention of a few prominent heroes, including Eraserhead and Present Mike, approached Izuku with a wary gaze. Misinterpreting Izuku's actions as those of a villain or a dangerous rogue quirk user. Their expressions were tense, suspicion evident in their eyes as they regarded him with caution. Caught between the urgent need to stabilize the veil and the overwhelming pressure of the hero's accusations, Izuku felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over him. He knew that he needed to explain himself, to make them understand that he was not a threat, but the chaos of the situation made it nearly impossible to communicate clearly. "I'm not a villain. I'm trying to help," Izuku shouted over the uproar of battle, his voice barely audible amidst the sounds of destruction and panic. Eraserhead's expression remained unyielding. "Your actions suggest otherwise," he replied, his tone laced with suspicion. "You're manipulating the very creatures causing this chaos. Explain yourself, now." Izuku's mind raced as he struggled to find the right words. He knew that he didn't have time to fully explain his abilities and their connection to the veil, but he also couldn't afford to stand idly by while the chaos continued to unfold. I can't explain everything right now," Izuku stammered, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I'm not controlling those creatures, the veil," but his words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the accusations and suspicions of the heroes before him. Present Mike stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Veil? What are you talking about, kid? We don't have time for your fantasies. If you don't stand down now, we'll have no choice but to take you in for questioning." The villain, recognizing Izuku as a threat to their plans, saw an opportunity to further their agenda. With a sinister grin, they unleashed their quirk, manipulating the fear and confusion to frame Izuku as the source of the chaos. Illusions began to ripple through the air, twisting and distorting reality with their malevolent power. Civilians screamed in terror as monstrous apparitions materialized before them, their forms looming large and menacing. To the horrified onlookers, it appeared as though Izuku was summoning the very monsters that had caused the panic. The heroes, already suspicious of Izuku's actions, fell victim to the deception, their doubts solidifying into certainty as they witnessed the illusionary horrors unfolding before them. Eraserhead's gaze hardened with resolve, his voice laced with condemnation as he turned to face Izuku. "This ends now," he declared, his words ringing out with authority. "You've been manipulating us from the start, using your quirk to create chaos and confusion. But we won't let you get away with it. Surrender yourself peacefully, or we'll be forced to take you down by any means necessary." Izuku's heart sank as he realized the depth of the villain's deception. Despite his attempts to explain himself, the illusions had only served to further incriminate him in the eyes of the heroes. Caught between the need to defend himself and the urgency to stop the villain's nefarious plot, he knew that time was running out. "You don't understand," he began, his words tinged with sorrow and frustration. "You never will. Heroes are close-minded at the best of times." Izuku's gaze hardened with determination. With a heavy heart and a steely resolve, he turned to face the heroes once more, his voice firm and unwavering. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't stay here and let you accuse me of something I didn't do. With that, Izuku turned and fled, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets as he raced towards the source of the chaos. I'm going after the kid, he called back to present Mike, his voice tinged with determination. You handle the other villain. We can't let this situation spiral out of control any further. Izuku's legs were ensnared by Eraserhead's capture weapon, causing him to topple to the ground with a grunt of pain. He felt a surge of frustration and fear wash over him. As he wiped blood from his nose, the ominous whisper from the veil sent a shiver down his spine, its words echoing in his mind with chilling clarity. The veil is unraveling. Reality will follow. The implications of the phrase sent a jolt of panic through Izuku's veins. If the veil was indeed unraveling, it meant that the fabric of reality itself was at risk of being torn apart. Izuku struggled against the capture weapon when suddenly he froze, eyes widening in horror as Eraserhead's monstrous entity materialized before him. The creature's elongated, humanoid head loomed menacingly close, its deep, hollow eye sockets emitting a dim, unsettling glow that sent chills down Izuku's spine. Those eyes locked onto his, inducing a wave of paralysis and helplessness that made him feel as though he were sinking into quicksand. The creature had no mouth, but the low, resonant hum it emitted reverberated through Izuku's bones, making his entire body vibrate with an eerie, unsettling rhythm. Inky, black tendrils wrapped around him, tightening their grip and making it impossible to move. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the hum that seemed to pulse through the very air around him. Izuku's mouth went dry as he struggled, not fully listening to Eraserhead as he was focused on the creature. Its razor-sharp fingers traced down Izuku's face. He felt a cold, searing pain, like icy fire etching into his skin. The creature's touch was almost playful, toying with him as if savoring his helplessness. Izuku's mind raced, desperately trying to break free, but the creature's grip was unyielding, its inky tendrils wrapping tighter around his body. Aizawa stood nearby, confusion etched on his face. He had activated his quirk, expecting Izuku to be rendered powerless, but instead, the boy seemed paralyzed, unable to move or defend himself. It was as if Izuku was caught in some invisible web, a web that Aizawa couldn't see or understand. The creature's hollow eye sockets glowed with a dim, unsettling light, and its low, resonant hum vibrated through Izuku's bones, amplifying his sense of dread. Izuku tried to speak, to warn Aizawa about the creature, but his voice caught in his throat, the fear paralyzing him further. Aizawa, seeing no other option, moved quickly. Aizawa's grip was firm as he hauled Izuku to his feet. You're under arrest, he said, his voice steady and authoritative. Izuku's gray eyes, dulled by pain and exhaustion, met Aizawa's. He wanted to protest, to explain the terrifying reality of the veil and its creatures, but he knew it would be futile. No one ever believed him. Eraserhead and Present Mike regrouped, the captured villain restrained and subdued. The two heroes exchanged puzzled glances as Aizawa recounted the bizarre incident with Izuku, detailing how his quirk seemed ineffective in the usual way and how the boy had frozen as if caught in some unseen snare. Present Mike's eyebrows shot up, his usual exuberance muted by genuine concern. Wait, so your quirk didn't work? That's a first, he said, casting a curious glance at Izuku. Izuku stood silently, his gaze fixed on the ground. The dull gray of his eyes betrayed no emotion, no hint of the internal turmoil he was experiencing. His silence was more than a refusal to speak. It was a protective barrier, a way to shield himself from a world that had repeatedly refused to understand or believe him. Aizawa's expression was unreadable, a mix of professional detachment and underlying worry. Kid, he said, his voice steady but softer than before, we need to know what's going on. Why did my quirk affect you differently? And what were you doing back there? Izuku remained silent, the weight of his secrets pressing heavily on him. He knew that any attempt to explain would likely fall on deaf ears, that the truth of the veil and its creatures was too fantastical, too incomprehensible for anyone else to believe. The memory of his mother's death, the constant dismissal of his experiences, and the torment of being branded as delusional all kept his lips sealed. Present Mike crouched down to meet Izuku's eye level, his usually boisterous demeanor replaced by a more gentle approach. Hey, kid, we just want to help. Whatever's going on, we need to understand it to make things right. Aizawa sighed, realizing they wouldn't get anything out of Izuku like this. He turned to present Mike. Let's take him in for questioning. Maybe if we give him some time, he'll open up. Present Mike nodded, standing up and giving Izuku a reassuring pat on the shoulder. We'll figure this out, kid. As they led Izuku away, the whispers of the veil continued to echo in his mind, their cryptic warnings and ominous phrases filling him with a growing sense of urgency. He knew he had to find a way to communicate the truth, to make them see the invisible horrors that threatened their reality. But for now, all he could do was follow the heroes, hoping that somehow, he could bridge the gap between his world and theirs before it was too late. Izuku sat in the sterile, cold interrogation room, the walls closing in on him with an oppressive sense of isolation. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, adding to the tension in the air. His gaze was fixed on the table, his mind racing through the events that led him here. The door creaked open, and a young rookie officer, her face fresh and kind, stepped in. Hey there, she said softly, can I get you something to drink? Water. Tea. Izuku remained silent, not even acknowledging her presence. The rookie's smile turned sad, filled with pity, before she left the room quietly, leaving him to his thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and a seasoned detective walked in. He was a grizzled man, with lines etched deeply into his face and eyes that had seen too much. He carried a file, which he dropped onto the table with a thud, the noise echoing in the small room. The detective took a seat opposite Izuku, leaning back in his chair. Izuku Midoriya, he began, his tone methodical. We've got quite the file on you. A troubled kid, bouncing from foster home to foster home. Mentally ill, they said. Seeing things that aren't there. Is that right? Izuku took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. How could he explain something so inexplicable? How could he make them understand that the world as they knew it was on the brink of collapse? The entities, Izuku began slowly, they're not just in my head. They're real. And the veil that separates our reality from theirs is weakening. The detective raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Entities. A weakening veil. Do you hear yourself, Izuku? Izuku's frustration grew. You don't have to believe me. But it's the truth. The veil is unraveling, and if we don't do something, our reality will follow. The detective sighed, closing the file with a snap. Look, Izuku, we're trying to help you. But if you keep spouting this nonsense, you're only making things worse for yourself. Izuku shook his head. You don't understand. This isn't about me. It's about everyone. If the veil breaks, those entities will cross over completely. And then it'll be too late for all of us. The detective stood up, clearly done with the conversation. We'll see about that. In the meantime, maybe some time in a padded cell will help you see reason. As the detective left the room, Izuku's heart sank. He knew he had to find a way to make them believe him. The fate of their reality depended on it. Izuku pleaded and pleaded with detective after detective to believe him, but the more he talked, the crazier he seemed. Desperation tinged his voice as he tried to convey the urgency of the situation. Despite the pitied looks and cruel bullying he had endured throughout his life, Izuku cherished his existence. The unraveling of the veil threatened not just his life, but everyone's very existence, and he couldn't stand by and let that happen. Please, you have to listen to me. Izuku's voice cracked with urgency. The veil is unraveling. If it breaks, those entities will be free. They'll destroy everything. The detective sighed, rubbing his temples. Kid, you're not making any sense. Monsters, veils, whispers, these are delusions. You need help. Izuku's frustration boiled over. I don't care if you think I'm crazy. Just consider it. If there's even a small chance I'm right, shouldn't we do something? The detective shook his head, his expression a mix of pity and exasperation. We're done here. You're clearly not in a state to help yourself. As the detective turned to leave, Izuku felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let their reality collapse without a fight. Wait, Izuku shouted, straining against the handcuffs. If you won't believe me, at least let me prove it. Take me back to where it happened. Let me show you. The detective paused, glancing back at Izuku. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but then he shook his head. Enough, kid. We're getting you the help you need. As the door closed behind the detective, Izuku felt a wave of despair wash over him. No one believed him, and time was running out. Izuku was escorted to the holding cell, his eyes darted from side to side, taking in the sight of the monstrous entities that lurked within the station. Each one seemed to be tethered to a specific person, staying close to them like a sinister guardian. It was clear that no one else could see them, and it only reinforced Izuku's sense of isolation. Inside the cell, Izuku slumped against the cold metal wall, his mind swirling with frustration and despair. He had tried to make them understand, but it was futile. No one was going to listen to him, not when the truth sounded so unbelievable. The monstrous entities prowled outside the cell, their presence a constant reminder of the impending doom that threatened their reality. Izuku knew he couldn't stop it alone, but with no one willing to believe him, he felt powerless. Resigning himself to his fate, Izuku closed his eyes, trying to push back the overwhelming sense of defeat. He may be alone in this fight for now, but he refused to give up. He would find a way to save their reality, even if that meant giving up his life. The night stretched on, each tick of the clock dragging slower than it should have. Izuku was on the verge of closing his eyes when a whisper, soft yet urgent, floated into his ears. The throne of the king has been challenged. His eyes shot open, heart pounding in his chest. What did it mean? Before he could even begin to process the cryptic message, the phones within the station erupted into a cacophony of noise, jolting the sleepy guards into high alert. Izuku watched as chaos unfolded around him, voices clamoring, lights flashing, and alarms blaring. Something big was happening, something beyond the usual routine of the station. With a surge of adrenaline, Izuku pushed himself up from the cold floor, his mind racing. Could this be connected to the unraveling veil? Was this the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when reality itself was at stake? Izuku's cries to be let out were drowned out by the ringing phones echoing through the station. Each ring felt like a hammer blow to his hopes. He continued to shake the cell bars with all his strength, desperation lending him newfound resolve. Please, he shouted, his voice strained with urgency. You have to let me out. This is only the beginning. I can help. But his pleas fell on deaf ears as the chaos of the situation consumed the attention of the guards and officers. The ringing phones seemed to drown out all other sounds, signaling the gravity of the situation unfolding beyond Izuku's cell. Frustration surged through him as he realized he was trapped, powerless to intervene. Izuku was still shaking the cell bars, his voice hoarse from shouting, when the door to the holding area burst open. He looked up, surprised to see Aizawa, a tense expression on his face rushed into the room. Without saying a word, Aizawa moved swiftly to the cell door, unlocking it and pulling Izuku out. The urgency in his movements and the panic in his eyes were unmistakable. You better have been telling the truth about this veil nonsense, Aizawa said, his voice low but firm. Without another word Aizawa rushed Izuku to UA, the tension in the air was palpable. They entered a conference room where a group of heroes had already gathered, their faces grim as they stared at the large projector screen displaying scenes of massive destruction caused by a villain. Izuku's eyes widened as he watched the chaos unfold on the screen. It was clear that the situation was dire, but what caught his attention was the way the villain seemed to have some control over the creatures of the veil. His mind raced with possibilities as he pieced together the cryptic message he had heard earlier. The king's throne has been challenged, Izuku muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Could it be that the villain was attempting to usurp control over the veil itself? Aizawa turned to Izuku, his gaze sharp. What did you say? Izuku shook his head, his thoughts racing. I think the villain is trying to manipulate the veil. He's challenging the balance of power. The other heroes in the room exchanged concerned glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. If the villain succeeded in gaining control over the veil, the consequences could be catastrophic. We need to stop him, Aizawa said, his voice firm. But we can't do it alone. Izuku, can you help us? Izuku stood in stunned silence. Had he heard that correctly? Heroes asking for his help. After all their dismissive glances, they wanted his help. Izuku's laughter echoed through the conference room, a bitter edge to its tone. As the heroes watched him, confusion etched on their faces, Izuku's expression hardened. Hold on a second, he said, his voice laced with irony. Let me get this straight. A few hours ago, you were labeling me a villain or worse. But now that my overactive imagination has been proven to be right, you expect me to help. The room fell silent as Izuku's words hung in the air, the weight of their implications sinking in. The heroes exchanged uneasy glances. Aizawa stepped forward, his gaze steady. Izuku, I understand why you're hesitant. But right now, our priority is stopping this villain and saving innocent lives. We need all the help we can get. Izuku shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You don't get it. You never believed in me until now. Why should I trust any of you? The heroes exchanged somber looks, realizing the consequences of their skepticism. They had dismissed Izuku's warnings, and now they were paying the price. Aizawa stepped closer to Izuku, his voice low but earnest. Izuku, I'm sorry. We made a mistake. But right now, we need to put aside our differences and work together to stop this threat. Lives are at stake, and we can't afford to let our pride get in the way. Izuku's scoff cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Pride. You think this is about pride? Wow. Shows where your priorities lie. As he turned to leave the room, his anger palpable in the air, he froze in his tracks. All Might stood in his path, his presence towering and imposing. Izuku's breath caught in his throat, all the pain and resentment he had buried deep within him rising to the surface. All Might looked at Izuku with concern, oblivious to the storm of emotions raging within the young man. Izuku, please. We need your help to stop this villain. Lives are at stake. Izuku's fists clenched at his sides, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and sorrow. How could All Might stand there, acting as if everything was fine, when he was the reason Izuku's life had been torn apart? You have some nerve, Izuku spat, his voice trembling with emotion. You stand there, asking for my help, after everything you've done. You're the reason my mother is no longer alive. All Might's expression faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. I don't understand. What are you talking about? Izuku's laughter was bitter and devoid of humor. Of course you don't understand. You never bothered to ask, did you? You never cared about the collateral damage, as long as you were hailed as the symbol of peace. The room fell silent, the weight of Izuku's words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. All Might's shoulders slumped, his expression pained. Izuku, I'm sorry, he said, his voice heavy with regret. But please, don't let your anger cloud your judgment. We need to work together to stop this villain. Izuku's anger was a storm barely contained. As he turned his ire from All Might to the other heroes in the room, his words cut through them like a scalpel, each one landing with surgical precision. You think you can just wave your hands and say, we need your help, and everything will be okay. Izuku spat, his eyes blazing with fury. You all stood by while I was labeled a villain, while I was called crazy. You dismissed me, ridiculed me. And now, because it's convenient for you, you want me to save the day. He turned his gaze to Endeavor, his voice dripping with disdain. And you, Endeavor, all your bluster and arrogance, thinking brute strength can solve everything. How many people have you burned in your quest to be number one? Endeavor's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, the truth of Izuku's words hitting uncomfortably close to home. Next, he turned to Best Jeanist. You preach about maintaining order and appearance, but where were you when I was crying out for help? Too busy keeping up appearances to notice the real problems. Best Jeanist shifted uncomfortably, his normally calm demeanor shaken by Izuku's accusation. Mirko, Izuku continued, his voice rising. You talk about justice and the thrill of the fight, but do you ever stop to think about the people left in the wake of your battles? The collateral damage. The lives disrupted. Mirko's confident expression faltered, the weight of Izuku's words settling over her like a heavy cloak. And Hawks, Izuku said, his voice breaking slightly. You spy on villains, play double agent, but what about the people who get caught in the crossfire of your espionage? Do their lives mean nothing? Hawks looked away, his usual easygoing smile nowhere to be seen. Izuku's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone as he looked around the room, his anger giving way to a deep, palpable sadness. You all call yourselves heroes, but you're blind to the suffering you leave behind. You only see the big picture, the flashy battles, the headlines. You don't see the lives shattered by your negligence. The room was silent, the heroes unable to meet Izuku's piercing gaze. They were used to praise, to adulation, not to this raw, unfiltered critique of their actions and the consequences of their choices. Finally, Izuku took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I'll help stop this villain, not because of any of you, but because innocent lives are at stake. But don't think for a second that I've forgiven you. The world doesn't need heroes like you. It needs people who actually care. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the heroes to grapple with the harsh truths he had laid bare. As Izuku stormed through the expansive halls of UA, his mind seethed with frustration and anger. Lost in his thoughts, he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings and collided forcefully with someone, the last person he wanted to see right now. Bakugo. Bakugo, his usual explosive temper not far from the surface, immediately erupted. Watch where you're going, you idiot. His voice dripped with disdain. As he looked down, he stood in silence for a moment. He couldn't hide his confusion at seeing Izuku at UA, despite trying his hardest to. What are you doing here? Izuku, still simmering with frustration from earlier, pushed himself up from where he had landed on the ground. He met Bakugo's fiery gaze with a glare of his own. I'm not in the mood, Kachan. He tried to move past Bakugo, but the blonde-haired boy blocked his path, his stance challenging. Like hell you are, Bakugo retorted, his voice low and dangerous. Izuku clenched his fists, trying to rein in his temper. He'd had enough of yelling and confrontation for one day, but Bakugo always knew how to get under his skin. The burn on his shoulder pulsed with the memories of the day it was created. Back off, Kachan, Izuku snapped, his voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. I've got bigger things to deal with than your stupid ego. Aizawa came walking down the hall, his usual stern expression etched deeper with fatigue. He noticed Bakugo and Izuku in the midst of their heated exchange and approached them, his presence commanding attention. What's going on here? Aizawa's voice cut through the tension, his gaze shifting between Bakugo and Izuku. Bakugo grumbled something unintelligible, clearly displeased at being interrupted. Aizawa's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. Instead, he gestured for Bakugo to return to class with a firm command. Go back to your class, Bakugo, Aizawa ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Bakugo shot one last glare at Izuku before storming off down the hall. Once Bakugo was out of earshot, Aizawa turned his attention fully to Izuku. The silence between them was suffocating, heavy with unspoken words and unaddressed tensions. Aizawa sighed heavily, rubbing the weariness from his eyes before speaking. I know that you have no reason to trust us and every reason to hate heroes, Aizawa began, his voice tinged with resignation. But you're the only one who seems to have the full picture of what's going on. Izuku met Aizawa's tired gaze, his own emotions still raw from the day's events. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Aizawa's words. The tension in the conference room was palpable, hanging heavy in the air like a storm waiting to break. Izuku stood silently beside the large conference table, his notebooks spread out in a haphazard array. Each one bore the scribbled title, the Veil Index, containing years of meticulous notes, diagrams, and sketches detailing the entities he had seen and the unraveling of the veil. The heroes gathered around the table, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease as they studied Izuku's writings. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily upon them as they tried to reconcile the fantastical descriptions and intricate drawings with the seemingly ordinary teenager standing before them. How is this possible? One hero murmured, his eyes flicking between the notebooks and Izuku. You're just a kid. How could you see and interact with these creatures? Izuku shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny, acutely aware of their disbelief and skepticism. He had anticipated this reaction, but it still stung to have his abilities and experiences questioned. I've always been able to see them, Izuku began quietly, his voice steady despite the nerves churning inside him. The veil has been weakening for years, and I've been trying to understand it, to document it. Another hero, a seasoned veteran with a grizzled demeanor, spoke up next. And you think this veil is what's causing the recent disturbances we've been seeing? Izuku nodded, his gaze earnest. Yes. The entities are becoming more visible, more aggressive. If we don't act soon, The room fell into a heavy silence as the heroes exchanged looks of concern and contemplation. They were trained to face villains and disasters, but this was something beyond their usual scope, a threat to reality itself. Aizawa, who had been observing quietly until now, spoke up in his typically blunt manner. We don't have time to debate the details. Midoriya, show us everything you know. We need to understand how to contain and neutralize these entities before they cause any more damage. Izuku nodded, grateful for Aizawa's support amidst the skepticism. With a deep breath, he began to guide the heroes through his notebooks, explaining the behavior patterns of the entities, their weaknesses, and potential strategies for containment. As the discussion progressed, Izuku could sense a shift in the room. The heroes, while still cautious, were beginning to accept the reality of the situation. They realized that despite his age and appearance, Izuku possessed invaluable knowledge that could make the difference between success and catastrophe. By the end of the briefing, the unease had not completely dissipated, but there was a shared determination among them. Their plan was simple: attack from all sides and neutralize the threat as quickly as possible. The heroes disbanded soon after. Not wanting Izuku to leave their sights, they forced Aizawa to take him in for the night, as his foster parents had disowned him moments after they heard of his arrest. As Izuku lay on the couch that night, surrounded by the unfamiliar stillness of Aizawa's apartment, he found himself drifting into a restless sleep. The events of the day had left his mind buzzing. His eyes fluttered as his mind finally succumbed to the sweet oblivion of sleep. Izuku could feel himself fall, deeper and deeper until he felt the ground underneath his feet once more. Opening his eyes, Izuku found himself standing before the veil. It shimmered before him like a translucent curtain, faintly revealing glimpses of the otherworldly entities that lurked beyond. The air hummed with an eerie energy, and Izuku felt a mixture of fear and fascination coursing through him. He reached out tentatively, however his mind was overwhelmed with strange symbols, distorted faces and static sounds. It looked like a Rorschach test gone horribly wrong. Flashes of places that he had never seen before clouded his vision, shifting and falling in on themselves before repeating the cycle all over again. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him in the dream, a shadowy silhouette with glowing yellow eyes. It reached out a hand towards Izuku, beckoning him closer. Despite the fear that gripped him, Izuku felt a strange sense of connection to this entity, as if it held the answers he sought. Before he could move closer, however, the dream began to dissolve. Izuku felt himself being pulled back, away from the veil and the mysterious figure. He woke with a start, the remnants of the dream fading like wisps of smoke. Izuku lay on the couch, his heart pounding and his mind racing. The dream had felt more real than any he could remember since childhood. It was as if the veil had reached out to him, offering a glimpse into its secrets and the dangers that lay beyond. As he tried to process the dream, Izuku knew one thing for certain: he had to find a way to strengthen the veil, to prevent it from unraveling further. The fate of their world depended on it, and he couldn't afford to ignore the warnings his subconscious had revealed. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the city as Izuku Midoriya stood alongside the pro-heroes, their differences momentarily set aside in the face of a greater threat. They had forged an uneasy alliance born of necessity, their shared goal clear: confront the villain who threatened to unleash chaos upon both the ordinary world and the Veil. The air crackled with tension as they prepared for their mission. Izuku adjusted the straps of his utility belt, feeling slightly ridiculous in this outfit. Despite his initial reluctance to join forces with the heroes who had once doubted him, he knew that their combined strengths were their best chance against the looming darkness. "Are we ready?" asked Endeavor, his voice a low rumble that cut through the night. Izuku nodded, his gaze steady as he met the eyes of the heroes around him. "As ready as we'll ever be." They moved swiftly through the shadowed streets, guided by intel gathered from both conventional sources and Izuku's unique insights into the Veil. The path ahead was treacherous, lined with hidden dangers and unexpected twists. Each step brought them closer to their quarry, but also deeper into the heart of darkness that threatened to consume them all. As they reached the outskirts of the villain's lair, a sense of foreboding gripped Izuku's heart. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy, signaling their proximity to the epicenter of the impending catastrophe. The landscape seemed to shift and distort around them, as if responding to the influence of the Veil. Trees twisted into gnarled shapes, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally across the ground, while the air itself felt charged with an otherworldly energy. For a fleeting moment, a deceptive calm settled over the landscape. The air grew still, and the unnatural silence seemed to stretch endlessly. But then, piercing through the quiet like a knife, a chilling chuckle echoed through the air, sending shivers down Izuku's spine and jolting the heroes from their tense vigilance. A figure emerged from the shadows, shrouded in darkness and exuding an aura of malevolence. The villain's laugh was cold and mocking, a harbinger of impending chaos. Before anyone could react, the villain's twisted grin widened, and with a gesture that defied comprehension, he plunged them deep into the veil. Reality shifted and warped around them, as if the very fabric of existence was being unraveled. Izuku's surroundings dissolved into a surreal dreamscape, where familiar landmarks twisted into nightmarish versions of themselves. Colors bled into unnatural hues, and the ground beneath their feet felt unstable and uncertain. In the heart of the veil, Izuku's senses were overwhelmed. The whispers that had once been faint echoes in his mind now assaulted him with the intensity of a roaring storm. It was as if every whispered warning, every cryptic message he had ever heard, bombarded his senses at once. Izuku staggered, feeling as if he were being pulled in multiple directions by the cacophony of voices. He instinctively slapped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the overwhelming noise, but it was futile. The whispers reverberated through his very being, resonating in his bones and echoing in his mind. The pressure built relentlessly, like Present Mike himself was shouting directly into his ears at full volume. Izuku gritted his teeth against the pain, his fingers pressing hard against his temples in a desperate attempt to find some semblance of peace amidst the chaos. Blood trickled between his fingers as the whispers relentlessly hounded him, testing the limits of his perception and sanity. As Izuku continued to struggle against the overwhelming presence of the entities, more of them emerged from the swirling fog that permeated the veil. The heroes gasped in astonishment and apprehension as they saw the monstrous creatures now standing beside them, each one a manifestation of a quirk that they had never imagined could take such a form. Izuku attempted to explain, to grunt out that these entities were manifestations of their quirks, but his words were stifled and choked off by the oppressive atmosphere of the veil. It was as if the very air around him conspired against him, stealing his breath and rendering his voice powerless. Aizawa and the other heroes exchanged alarmed glances, their expressions reflecting a mix of fear and determination. They could see now the true extent of the threat they faced. The veil not only distorted reality but gave form to the latent powers and fears lurking within. The entities surrounding them varied wildly in appearance and demeanor. Some resembled twisted versions of animals, their features distorted and monstrous. Others seemed to embody elemental forces, with crackling energy or swirling shadows emanating from their forms. Izuku clenched his fists in frustration, his mind racing for a solution even as the oppressive presence of the veil bore down upon him. He knew they couldn't afford to hesitate or falter. They had to find a way to push through, to confront the villain and restore order to the chaos unraveling around them. With a determined grit of his teeth, he managed to steady himself, forcing himself to focus amidst the turmoil. The villain's curious gaze bore into Izuku, sending a chill down his spine as he felt exposed under the malevolent scrutiny. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination as the villain tilted his head, studying him with unsettling interest. A twisted smile spread across the villain's face, revealing a darkness that sent shivers through the assembled heroes. "So, you're the boy intrinsically connected to the veil," the villain sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "The entities whispered of your presence, of your significance. They told me that the only way I can claim my rightful place as king is to rid myself of you." Izuku's heart pounded in his chest as he stared defiantly at the villain, his mind racing with the implications of the threat. He had suspected that his connection to the veil was more than mere happenstance, but now it seemed that this connection made him a target, a pivotal piece in the villain's twisted ambitions. Aizawa stepped forward, his expression hardening with resolve. "You won't lay a finger on him," he growled, his voice laced with authority and a hint of warning. The villain chuckled darkly, unfazed by Aizawa's defiance. "You heroes always think you can protect everyone," he mocked, his gaze flickering between Izuku and the assembled heroes. "But you're outnumbered, outmatched. More entities materialized from the shadows, their forms shifting and morphing into grotesque shapes that loomed menacingly around them. With a wave of his hand, the villain unleashed a surge of dark energy, sending the entities into a frenzy. They advanced menacingly, their forms shifting and contorting with each step, as if eager to carry out their master's bidding. As the confrontation loomed overhead, Izuku knew one thing for certain. They couldn't afford to lose. As the battle raged on between the heroes and the villain within the distorted realm of the veil, Izuku felt a profound shift within himself. With each passing moment, he could sense a newfound connection to the entities that surrounded them. The whispers that once plagued his mind now seemed to merge with his thoughts, guiding him with an eerie familiarity. In the midst of combat, as punches were exchanged and quirks clashed, Izuku found himself tapping into the energies of the veil effortlessly. It was as if he had unlocked a dormant potential within himself, fusing seamlessly with the entities that had once seemed so alien and threatening. Creating constructs from the veil's energy became as natural as breathing to Izuku. He could shape and manipulate the fabric of reality around him with a precision that belied his previous uncertainties. Shadows coalesced into protective barriers, tendrils of energy lashed out to ensnare their adversaries. The longer Izuku remained immersed in the veil, the more he felt at home in its surreal landscape. It was as though he had found his place within this chaotic realm, where the rules of reality were mutable and his connection to the entities granted him power beyond his wildest dreams. Izuku and the heroes fought tooth and nail against the villain and his formidable defenses. With each attack, they chipped away at the barriers that protected their adversary, but the realization of their daunting task began to weigh heavily upon them. The villain's power was vast, his control over the veil and its entities proving to be a formidable challenge that tested their every strategy and resolve. Desperation etched lines of concern and weariness on the faces of Aizawa and the other heroes. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes, acknowledgement of the dire situation they found themselves in, and the grim reality that their efforts might not be enough to overcome the overwhelming odds. Amidst the chaos of battle, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes. It was a prickling sensation at the back of his mind, an unsettling intuition that whispered of a presence lurking just beyond their perception. He scanned the shifting shadows of the veil, his senses attuned to the slightest hint of movement or anomaly. But the source of the unease remained elusive, a nagging suspicion that added an additional layer of tension. The villain, sensing their uncertainty and exploiting their momentary hesitation, launched a counteroffensive. Dark tendrils of energy lashed out, weaving through the veil like serpents seeking prey. The entities, fueled by their master's commands, intensified their attacks, their monstrous forms closing in with relentless determination. Izuku gritted his teeth, rallying his focus amidst the chaos. He couldn't afford distractions or doubts now. With each passing moment, the battle grew more perilous, the stakes higher than ever before. They had to find a way to break through the villain's defenses, to turn the tide in their favor before it was too late. The phrase, "When the veil bleeds gold, the king shall rise," echoed ominously in Izuku's mind. It had been months since he last heard those words, and their sudden resurgence now sent a chill down his spine. Lost in thought, Izuku's attention momentarily faltered, a split second of distraction amidst the chaotic battle unfolding around him. It proved to be a critical moment, a tipping point that shifted the balance of the fight. Betrayal shattered the fragile unity of the heroes like a lightning bolt from a clear sky. Izuku, reeling from the unexpected blow that sent him crashing to the ground, struggled against the whirlwind of pain and confusion clouding his senses. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the unthinkable. A trusted ally, respected among their ranks, had turned on him with chilling determination. As Izuku pushed himself upright, the hero loomed over him, their expression a mask of conviction and cold resolve. The once familiar voice now rang with a distorted righteousness that sent a chill down Izuku's spine. "This is for the greater good," the hero declared, their tone unwavering as they justified their betrayal. Izuku Midoriya is but one sacrifice needed to ensure the safety of the world. Izuku's breath caught in his throat, disbelief warring with the searing pain radiating from his injuries. The sudden betrayal had stunned Izuku and the other heroes into a momentary paralysis, but as the traitor wrapped him in a headlock, reality snapped back with brutal clarity. Izuku struggled against the vice-like grip, feeling the traitor's arm constrict around his neck, cutting off his air supply and sending spikes of pain through his body. Around them, Aizawa and the other heroes hesitated, their instincts torn between protecting Izuku and apprehending the traitor. The air crackled with tension and urgency, the battlefield now a stage for a different kind of conflict. "Don't come any closer," the traitor shouted, their voice filled with desperation and a chilling resolve. "I'll harm him, I swear." Izuku's vision blurred momentarily from lack of oxygen, but he fought against the darkness encroaching at the edges of his consciousness. He couldn't afford to lose. Aizawa, ever vigilant and calculating, weighed their options with a steely gaze. His eyes flickered with concern for Izuku, but also with a hardened determination to resolve the crisis swiftly and decisively. The other heroes, poised for action, awaited Aizawa's signal, their own expressions reflecting a mix of anguish and resolve. Izuku struggled against the traitor's grip, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched desperately for a weakness, a way to break free. But the traitor held firm, their hold unyielding and suffocating. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each moment stretched taut. Through the haze of pain and disbelief, Izuku's eyes locked onto the villain's smug satisfaction, a chilling smile etched across their face like a twisted mask of triumph. The realization hit Izuku like a physical blow, driving home the depth of the betrayal. This hero, once trusted and respected among their ranks, had offered him up as a bargaining chip, a peace offering to the villain in exchange for some perceived advantage, oblivious or indifferent to the devastating consequences of their actions. Pain radiated through Izuku's body from where the traitor's grip tightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he struggled against the crushing pressure on his neck. The villain's laughter echoed through the chaotic battlefield, a sinister symphony that mocked their unity and resolve. "You see, heroes," the villain taunted, their voice dripping with malice. "Even your own kind are willing to sacrifice for what they believe is right. How noble, yet how utterly foolish." Izuku's thoughts swirled with a mix of betrayal and anger. He couldn't let the villain's smug satisfaction be the last thing he saw. He couldn't let their treachery go unanswered. As the villain approached Izuku and the traitor, a malevolent smile twisted their features, embodying a triumphant malice that chilled the air around them. With a casual yet calculated movement, the villain extended a hand and tapped Izuku gently on the forehead. The moment the villain's touch made contact, a surge of dark energy rippled through Izuku's body. The veil's energy, which Izuku had harnessed with such determination and resilience, now turned against him. Waves of exhaustion washed over him like an engulfing tide, draining his strength and clouding his senses. Izuku fought against the overwhelming weariness, his mind struggling to stay alert even as his body betrayed him. The villain's mocking words echoed in his ears, a cruel reminder of his vulnerability in the face of such formidable adversaries. "Not much of a king, are you?" the villain taunted, their voice a venomous whisper that cut through the haze of Izuku's fading consciousness. The traitor, standing beside them, watched with a mix of regret and apprehension, their earlier resolve now tinged with doubt. The consequences of their betrayal unfolded before them in stark clarity, the cost of their misguided actions laid bare in the vulnerable figure of Izuku. Aizawa and the other heroes, witnessing Izuku's fall into unconsciousness. But despite their efforts, the villain remained poised and unyielding, their grip on the veil's power unshakable. The battlefield around them raged on, a tumultuous dance of light and shadow, hope and despair. The battlefield froze in disbelief as the villain's hand swept through the air with a chilling finality. In an instant, the traitor standing beside Izuku erupted into a fine pink mist, dissipating into nothingness before their horrified eyes. The shock of witnessing such a brutal and sudden end to their former ally left the heroes stunned and reeling. Aizawa and the others stood frozen in place, their minds struggling to process the swift and merciless display of power. The villain's actions had shattered any semblance of hope for a peaceful resolution, leaving only a grim realization of the depths of their adversary's malevolence. With Izuku cradled in their arms, the villain's sinister smile widened as they vanished into the swirling shadows of the veil, leaving behind a palpable silence that echoed with uncertainty and fear. The heroes, grappling with the aftermath of betrayal and loss, exchanged looks of anguish and determination. "He took him," one hero murmured, their voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to speak the truth aloud. Aizawa's jaw clenched with a steely resolve. "We have to find them," he declared, his voice a quiet but firm command amidst the chaos. As the heroes prepared to rush towards where the villain and Izuku had disappeared, a surreal calm descended upon their surroundings. The chaotic battlefield, once filled with swirling shadows and veil energy, seemed to recede like a dissipating storm. The oppressive tension that had gripped them moments ago eased, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Confusion etched deep lines on the heroes' faces as they exchanged bewildered glances. Aizawa's sharp eyes scanned their surroundings, searching for any sign of the villain's trail or Izuku's whereabouts, but all he found was the familiar landscape of their city, now returned to its mundane facade. What just happened? One hero muttered, their voice a whisper amidst the lingering silence. Another hero shook their head in disbelief. It's like everything just reset, they murmured, their gaze flickering with uncertainty. Aizawa's mind raced with questions, grappling to make sense of the inexplicable shift that had taken place. Had they been deceived by some illusion cast by the villain? Or had they glimpsed a glimpse into a darker reality that lingered just beyond their perception? We need to regroup. Aizawa finally spoke, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence. We can't afford to lose focus now. The heroes nodded solemnly, their determination reigniting despite the disorientation that still hung heavy in the air. They knew that their mission was far from over, that the villain's threat still loomed, and Izuku's fate remained uncertain. Izuku felt himself plummeting through an endless void, the sensation of falling consuming him completely. Darkness enveloped him, pressing in from all sides, a void that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. His mind swirled with confusion and fear, grappling to make sense of his surroundings. As he fell, an eerie calm began to settle over him, as if he were moving beyond the reach of his own fear. Suddenly, his descent slowed, and he felt his feet touch something solid. The sensation of ground beneath him was jarring after the endless freefall, and he staggered slightly, trying to regain his balance. Looking around, Izuku saw nothing but the vast, impenetrable darkness of the void. It was an expanse devoid of light or life, an alien landscape where the concepts of up and down, near and far, seemed to lose all meaning. Then, cutting through the oppressive silence, a haunting voice whispered, its words chilling and cryptic. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa. The words sent a shiver down Izuku's spine, the eerie cadence resonating deep within him. He tried to focus, to make sense of the voice and its message, but the darkness seemed to close in around him. Why am I here? Izuku called out, his voice echoing into the void. But there was no immediate response, only a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on him like a weight. After what felt like an eternity, the voice spoke again, this time with a cryptic phrase that only deepened the mystery. Carcosa is where each king rests. Izuku's mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. Carcosa, a name that seemed to carry an otherworldly weight, a place shrouded in mystery and darkness. The mention of kings resting here hinted at a deeper significance, something tied to the veil and the entities that had haunted him for so long. Who are you? Izuku tried again, his voice steadier now despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Why am I here? But again, the void offered no answers. The oppressive silence returned, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. Izuku took a deep breath, steadying himself as he tried to focus his thoughts. Carcosa is where each king rests, he repeated to himself, trying to decipher the meaning. Was this place some kind of resting ground for those connected to the veil? Was he destined to be one of these kings, or was he here to confront the true king of this dark realm? Izuku began to walk, his steps steady and determined, but it felt as though he was making no progress. The void around him seemed to shift and swirl, creating the illusion of movement while keeping him trapped in the same spot. Frustration gnawed at him as he realized he was caught in some kind of nightmarish loop, a prisoner in this endless, featureless darkness. Is this a test? He shouted into the void, his voice tinged with anger and desperation. What do you want from me? For a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence, but then the haunting voice returned, this time closer and more resonant, as if it were right beside him. To move forward, you must understand. Carcosa is not just a place, it is a state of being. Izuku's mind raced, trying to comprehend the cryptic message. A state of being. What does that even mean? Carcosa is where each king rests, the voice repeated, echoing the earlier phrase. To become a king, you must embrace your role, your power, and your destiny. Confusion etched itself deep within Izuku's features. He had no clue in the slightest of what they were saying. Embrace his role, his power. What role? What power? He closed his eyes, trying to center himself amidst the chaos. Opening his eyes once more, he was standing in the ancient high courtroom of Lost Carcosa. Izuku was overwhelmed by the grandeur and decrepitude that surrounded him. The chamber, chipped with age and abandonment, stretched high above him, its towering pillars topped with shadowy figures draped in yellow tattered capes. The hoods of these figures obscured their faces, leaving Izuku to wonder if there was anything beneath or if they were simply empty voids. As he strained to take in the sight of the towering figures, a chill ran down his spine as they spoke in unison, their voices echoing through the vast chamber. Welcome to Lost Carcosa. Izuku's heart raced with a mix of awe and apprehension. He had read stories and whispers about Carcosa, but to stand here now, surrounded by its enigmatic guardians, was beyond anything he had imagined. The air in the chamber felt heavy with ancient power and secrets long buried beneath layers of time and mystery. What is this place? Izuku managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to carry through the chamber with clarity. The figures remained silent for a moment, their presence imposing and otherworldly. Then, as if in response to his question, they spoke again in their collective voice. Carcosa is the heart of the Vale, where past and future converge. It is a place of kings and cosmic truths. Izuku's mind raced, trying to comprehend the weight of their words. Kings and cosmic truths. What did they mean? Was he truly meant to be a king in this strange realm, or was this some kind of test, a trial by the Vale itself? Before he could gather his thoughts, the figures continued, their voices resonating with an eerie harmony. You have been chosen, Izuku Midoriya, to wield the power of the Vale. Embrace your destiny, for Carcosa awaits its rightful king. Aizawa and the heroes, their minds still grappling with the bizarre and harrowing encounter they had just endured, regrouped in the town square. The air was thick with tension, and their expressions were a mix of determination and lingering shock. They had been thrust into a confrontation that defied their understanding of reality, and now, they had to confront the grim consequences of their situation. As they gathered, a large screen blinked to life with an eerie hum, drawing the attention of every hero present. The screen flickered, and the villain's menacing visage filled the display. His eyes gleamed with malevolent satisfaction, and a twisted smile curled on his lips. Heroes, the villain's voice boomed, dripping with contempt and amusement. You have fought bravely, but your efforts are in vain. You have 24 hours before I unleash the full extent of my powers upon this city. The heroes tensed, their eyes fixed on the screen, absorbing the gravity of the threat. The villain's presence radiated an unsettling confidence, a dark certainty that he held the upper hand. And just to motivate you, the villain continued, his tone mocking, allow me to show you something. He reached out and pulled a figure into the frame, Izuku. The sight of him, bruised and helpless, sent a surge of anger and fear through the gathered heroes. This little king, the villain sneered, emphasizing the title with a mixture of disdain and derision, is in my hands. If you don't pick up the pace, it will be too late for him. The screen went dark, leaving the heroes in a charged silence. The weight of the villain's words hung heavily in the air, a dire reminder of the stakes they faced. Aizawa clenched his fists, his jaw set with determination. We need to move fast, he said, his voice steady but urgent. We have to find Izuku and stop the villain before the 24 hours are up. The other heroes nodded, their resolve solidifying in the face of the impending danger. They knew that their time was limited, and the city's fate, along with Izuku's life, hung in the balance. Any ideas on where to start? One of the heroes asked, their eyes scanning the group for suggestions. Aizawa took a deep breath, his mind racing through the possibilities. We need to use every resource we have. Track any unusual energy signatures, analyze any clues left behind, and gather information from anyone who might have seen something. He turned to the group, his gaze unwavering. We can't afford to waste any time. Let's split up and cover as much ground as possible. We'll regroup here in 2 hours to share any findings. With that, the heroes dispersed. Aizawa couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. The way the villain referred to Izuku as The little king was awed, almost as if he knew something about Izuku that the heroes didn't. The implications of this title were puzzling and foreboding. Why was Izuku, a boy who had always been seen as quirkless, now being called a king by a villain so deeply entwined with the veil? As these thoughts swirled in Aizawa's mind, a whisper caught his attention, cutting through the cacophony of his racing thoughts. The voice was both familiar and strange, echoing with an eerie resonance. "The boy is a herald of Carcosa," it said. Aizawa's eyes widened, and he looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the whisper, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as if the words were spoken directly into his mind. He felt a chill run down his spine as the voice continued, "If the herald dies, the veil will shatter." The gravity of the situation became painfully clear. Izuku was not just a victim in this twisted game, he was a pivotal figure, a herald of Carcosa. Aizawa clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He gathered the heroes, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to find Izuku now, more than ever. There's more at stake here than we realized. The villain called him a king for a reason." The confusion among the other heroes was palpable as Aizawa relayed the cryptic information about Izuku being a herald of Carcosa and the potential consequences tied to his fate. They gathered around Aizawa, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism. "How do you know this, Aizawa?" one hero asked, their brow furrowed with genuine curiosity. Aizawa hesitated for a moment, grappling with how to explain the inexplicable. "I heard a whisper," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It spoke of Izuku being a herald of Carcosa and the danger if something were to happen to him." "A whisper," another hero echoed, disbelief coloring their tone. "What do you mean, a whisper?" "It was like a voice in my head," Aizawa admitted, feeling the weight of their collective skepticism. "It said that if the herald dies, the veil will shatter." The heroes exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to process this revelation. Aizawa was known for his pragmatism and skepticism, not for believing in whispers or cryptic messages. Yet, there was an undeniable urgency in his voice, a seriousness that couldn't be ignored. "We don't have time to dwell on where this information came from," Aizawa continued, his tone firm and resolute. "What matters now is finding Izuku and stopping the villain before it's too late." The heroes nodded reluctantly, recognizing the urgency of the situation despite their reservations. They knew that they had to act quickly. However, a terrified scream shattered the air, piercing through the relative quiet like a knife. Aizawa and the other heroes immediately sprang into action, rushing outside to confront the source of the commotion. As they emerged into the open, the sight that greeted them confirmed their worst fears: the villain had lied. All around them, monstrous creatures from the veil were spilling out from cracks in reality, their grotesque forms twisting and writhing as they poured into the city. Chaos erupted in the streets as people screamed and fled in terror, trying to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before their eyes. Aizawa cursed under his breath. "Of course, the villain lied," he muttered, his jaw clenched in frustration. This villain seemed to crave nothing but power and chaos, and now he was getting exactly what he wanted. The heroes quickly formed a defensive line, their instincts kicking in as they prepared to protect the civilians and push back the encroaching horrors. Each hero summoned their quirk, ready to fight against the nightmarish entities spilling into their world. "Everyone, focus on protecting the civilians and containing these creatures," Aizawa commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with authority. "We need to buy ourselves some time and figure out a way to stop this madness." The heroes nodded, their determination clear. They knew they were up against a formidable and unpredictable foe, but they couldn't afford to back down now. The safety of the city, and possibly the entire world, depended on their ability to hold the line. As they engaged the monstrous creatures, Aizawa's mind raced. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. The Veil's entities were not just random beasts, they were manifestations of something much larger and more dangerous. Aizawa fought his way to one of the other heroes, dodging and striking at the creatures with precision. "We need to find a way to close these cracks," he shouted over the rage of battle. "If we conceal them, we might be able to stop more of these things from getting through." Another hero, a young woman with the ability to manipulate energy fields, nodded in agreement. "I can try to contain some of the breaches, but I'll need cover." "Do it," Aizawa ordered. Everyone else, Give her the space she needs. The heroes redoubled their efforts, coordinating their attacks to push back the entities and create a perimeter around the cracks in reality. As the young woman began her work, Aizawa kept a watchful eye on the situation, knowing that this was just a temporary measure. They needed to find Izuku and stop the villain to truly end this nightmare. All around them, chaos reigned supreme. Eldritch creatures, twisted and grotesque, tore through buildings, their immense strength and unnatural forms leaving destruction in their wake. The heroes fought valiantly, but it was clear that they were being overwhelmed by the sheer number and ferocity of the entities pouring through the cracks in reality. Aizawa moved with calculated precision, using his erasure quirk to temporarily nullify the abilities of the more dangerous creatures, buying the other heroes precious moments to regroup and mount counterattacks. But even with their combined efforts, it felt like they were barely holding the line. We can't keep this up forever. A hero shouted over the din, their voice tinged with desperation. There are too many of them. Aizawa nodded grimly. He knew they needed a more permanent solution. His mind raced, searching for any possible way to turn the tide. The whispers about Izuku and the veil kept echoing in his thoughts. If Izuku was indeed a herald of Carcosa, then perhaps he held the key to stopping this invasion. As he fought, Aizawa's eyes scanned the battlefield, looking for any sign of the young hero. He spotted a group of civilians trapped under the rubble of a collapsing building and quickly moved to help them. Stay calm, he urged, using his scarf to lift debris and free the trapped people. Get to safety as quickly as you can. One of the civilians, a young woman with tears streaming down her face, grabbed his arm. Please, you have to save us. Those monsters, they're everywhere. We're doing everything we can, Aizawa assured her, gently but firmly. Just keep moving and stay together. We'll handle the rest. As the civilians fled, Aizawa turned back to the fray. He needed to find a way to communicate with the other heroes and coordinate a plan. He activated his communicator, trying to reach any of his allies. This is Aizawa. We need to regroup and come up with a strategy to close these cracks and stop the creatures from coming through. Does anyone have eyes on Izuku? There was a crackle of static, then a familiar voice came through. Aizawa. I saw the villain heading towards the old factory district. He had Izuku with him. Aizawa's heart skipped a beat. I'm on my way. Anyone who can, meet me there. We need to stop the villain and get Izuku back. He sprinted through the chaos, weaving between the eldritch creatures and avoiding falling debris. The city's outskirts loomed ahead, the old factory district a maze of crumbling buildings and darkened alleys. Aizawa's determination burned brighter with every step. He knew that time was running out, and the fate of the city, and perhaps the world, rested on their ability to stop the villain and save Izuku. As Aizawa approached the factory district, he noticed something peculiar about the eldritch creatures. They seemed to flicker in and out of reality, their forms unstable and wavering as if tethered to some unseen force. Aizawa's instincts told him that this phenomenon was significant. Despite the chaos, a sliver of hope sparked within him. Izuku was still alive. Aizawa couldn't explain how he knew this. It was a gut feeling, almost like the mysterious whisper that had guided him earlier. The sensation was familiar and reassuring, yet unsettling. It was as if something beyond his comprehension was affirming Izuku's survival. Determined to act on this intuition, Aizawa quickened his pace, weaving through the labyrinthine alleys of the old factory district. The eldritch creature's flickering presence seemed to guide him, a bizarre beacon amidst the turmoil. He reached a large, decrepit factory building, its facade crumbling and overgrown with vines. The air was thick with the unnatural energy of the veil, making every breath feel like an effort. He heard muffled voices from within the building. Steeling himself, Aizawa silently made his way inside, navigating through the shadows and debris. He found the villain standing in the center of an expansive, dimly lit room, surrounded by the flickering entities. Izuku lay on the floor, unconscious but visibly alive, his body occasionally glowing with a strange, ethereal light. The villain's eyes locked onto Aizawa as he entered. Ah, Eraserhead. I was expecting you, the villain sneered, his voice dripping with malice. You're just in time to witness the dawn of a new era. Aizawa's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting between the villain and Izuku. Let him go, he demanded, his voice cold and unyielding. This ends now. The villain laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You still don't understand, do you? This boy is the key to the veil. His very existence keeps it in balance. And now, with him under my control, I will reshape reality itself. Aizawa's mind raced. He had to find a way to free Izuku and stop the villain from achieving his twisted goals. As he took a step forward, he felt the familiar whisper again, a soft murmur in the back of his mind. Trust in the Herald. Drawing upon his years of training and experience, Aizawa activated his erasure quirk, his eyes glowing red as he locked onto the villain. You're not going to win, he said with steely resolve. The villain's smirk faltered for a moment as his powers were nullified. The flickering of the eldritch creatures intensified, their forms growing more unstable. Aizawa seized the opportunity, rushing forward to reach Izuku. Just as he was about to grab the boy, the villain regained his composure and unleashed a wave of dark energy, pushing Aizawa back. Fool, you think you can stop me so easily? Suddenly, the villain snapped his head to the left, his eyes widening as if he were seeing something only he could perceive. His expression twisted with fury as he began to argue with an unseen force, his voice growing louder and more frantic. No, this wasn't part of the plan. You promised me, he bellowed, his anger reaching a fever pitch. Abruptly, the villain erupted into a fit of rage, his eyes wild with madness. He pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming wickedly under the dim light, and rushed at the still unconscious Izuku with murderous intent. But just as he was about to strike, an unseen force intervened. The knife stopped inches from Izuku's chest, suspended in midair as if held by invisible hands. The villain struggled against the unseen restraint, his face contorting with frustration and disbelief. What is this? He screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Aizawa, still holding Izuku, watched in shock as the scene unfolded. Figures in yellow tattered robes slowly flickered into view, their presence both ethereal and commanding. The glow emanating from Izuku intensified, growing brighter with each passing second. A golden crown materialized above his head, hovering like a halo. As Izuku's eyes fluttered open, they were no longer a dull gray but an otherworldly yellow, glowing with an eerie brilliance. The eldritch creatures that had been wreaking havoc across the city suddenly halted their rampage. Drawn towards Izuku, they moved with a newfound purpose, forming a reverent procession. Upon reaching him, each creature bowed deeply, like soldiers paying homage to their sovereign. The true king has ascended, the figures in yellow robes spoke in unison, their voices resonating through the air. Aizawa and the other heroes watched in awe and confusion as the transformation unfolded before them. The villain, still restrained by the unseen force, stared in horror and disbelief. No, this can't be happening, he screamed, his voice trembling with fear. Izuku, now fully conscious and radiating power, looked around with a calm yet commanding presence. He turned his gaze towards the villain, his yellow eyes piercing through the darkness. Your reign of terror ends now, he declared, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to reverberate through the veil itself. The villain struggled, attempting to free himself from the invisible hold. You don't understand. This power, it belongs to me. Izuku shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. You were never meant to wield this power. The veil chose its king long ago. He raised his hand, and the crown above his head glowed even brighter. The eldritch creatures, now fully under his control, surrounded the villain, their presence overwhelming. The figures in yellow robes stepped forward, their movements synchronized and deliberate. The king has spoken. The usurper shall be cast into the void. With a wave of his hand, Izuku directed the creatures to drag the villain away. The villain's screams echoed through the air, growing fainter as he was pulled into the depths of the veil, his fate sealed. As the figure in the yellow robes spoke their cryptic words to Izuku, the air seemed to hold its breath. Carcosa will be awaiting your return one day, they murmured as they bowed to Izuku one last time before fading into the ether, their mission complete. The ethereal glow surrounding Izuku and the golden crown halo above his head began to flicker, fading until they disappeared completely. Izuku swayed, overwhelmed by the immense energy he had just channeled. The strain of becoming the vessel for the veil's power had taken its toll. He collapsed, Aizawa and the other heroes rushing to his side in concern. Izuku, are you okay? Aizawa asked urgently, kneeling beside him. Izuku managed a weak smile, his breathing labored. I think so. It's just a lot, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The heroes exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do next. Aizawa's gaze turned to where the villain had been dragged away by the eldritch creatures under Izuku's command. Where did they take him? He asked, his tone serious. Izuku blinked, seeming slightly disoriented. I'm not sure, he replied, furrowing his brow in concentration. They've returned to the Vale. He's gone. Aizawa nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The threat had been neutralized, but the aftermath left many unanswered questions. The heroes helped Izuku to his feet, supporting him as they made their way back to the city center. As they walked, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the recovering city. The damage caused by the Vale's instability was evident, but with Izuku's intervention, the worst had been averted. Izuku, Aizawa began, his voice gentle yet probing, what happened back there? How did you control everything? Izuku paused, reflecting on the experience. I'm not entirely sure myself, he admitted. As they emerged from the factory district, the heroes regrouped, their thoughts still lingering on the events of the night. The city before them was a mess, with rubble and destruction scattered in their wake. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were cracked and broken, and the remnants of the battle were evident. Heroes and citizens alike were exhausted, yet there was a palpable sense of relief in the air. They had survived, and for now, the immediate threat was over. Aizawa helped Izuku to a waiting ambulance, where medical personnel quickly assessed his condition. The young boy was drained but conscious, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and a newfound determination. As they stood amidst the wreckage, the other heroes began to coordinate efforts to assist those affected by the chaos. Rescue teams moved through the debris, searching for any survivors and tending to the wounded. The scale of the damage was overwhelming, but the heroes' resolve remained unbroken. Months had passed since the dramatic events that had thrust Izuku into the role of the King in Yellow. The chaos and devastation had slowly faded from the city's memory, replaced by a tentative peace and ongoing reconstruction efforts. For Izuku, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the weight of his newfound responsibilities still lingered. Standing at the gates of UA, Izuku was a cocktail mix of nerves and excitement. The prestigious academy had accepted him despite his unconventional background, recognizing his potential. Yet, as he prepared to step into a new chapter of his life, the daunting prospect of high school filled him with apprehension. He glanced around at the bustling courtyard, students chatting animatedly and preparing for the day ahead. Some recognized him, offering nods of respect or curious glances. Others seemed oblivious to his presence, caught up in their own conversations and activities. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Izuku reminded himself of all he had overcome. The Veil, Carcosa, and the mysteries that had reshaped his world were behind him, at least for now. Here at UA, he had the chance to hone his skills, forge new friendships, and perhaps find answers to lingering questions about his abilities. As he entered the academy, Izuku was greeted by familiar faces and new challenges. The lessons were rigorous, the training intense, but he threw himself into his studies with determination. Alongside his classmates, many of whom had their own unique quirks and backgrounds, Izuku found a sense of camaraderie and purpose. Throughout it all, Aizawa remained a steady mentor and guide, offering guidance and support as Izuku navigated the complexities of being both a student and a hero in training. Together, they worked to ensure that the events of that fateful night would not define Izuku's future, but rather serve as a testament to his resilience and strength. As the shadows lengthened and the echoes of his journey whispered in the halls of UA, Izuku Midoriya, once a quirkless boy, now stood as the King in Yellow, his destiny entwined with mysteries yet to unfold in the unseen depths of Carcosa. The end. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Now we will see you in the next video.